I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 276. Others use guns to colonize, but I use information gaps. They all lined up and threw them into the Bay of Gabes. On the pier, more than a dozen Tunisian legionnaires on horseback shouted loudly in Arabic point in front of 3 gangplanks connected to the transport ships. Doctors from the twin trading company inspected these former Tunisian guards, put the able-bodied ones on the ship, and drove the rest away without hesitation. Those who got on the boat breathed a sigh of relief. At least they would not starve to death in the future. And according to the official commitment of Tunisia, as long as they perform well in New Zealand, they can take a family member there. After 1 year, a Tunisian guard with an unshaven beard and tattered clothes pulled his wife and 2 children. Under the leadership of the soldiers, he bypassed the crowd and went directly to the boat. He immediately attracted many envious eyes. That was a blacksmith's high-end talents, so they can take the whole family on board the ship immediately. Not long after, the 3 transport ships were filled with people and slowly sailed out of the port. The other 3 empty ships immediately docked at the dock and continued to load coolies. Yes, from this moment on, the so-called Tunisian guards have become history. From now on, they will only have one identity, that is, New Zealand peons. At noon the next day, the Gemini fleet, loaded with 5,000 peons, set sail and sailed around the Strait of Gibraltar to the distant island of New Zealand. South Pacific. Cook Strait. On the bow deck of the Gemini Company's armed merchant ship Melodious, Mary and Dufresne looked at the wide and flat black beach in the distance. And he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Before, neither France nor Russia had much exploration of this huge island called New Zealand, which is a landmass about the same size as the United Kingdom, but His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was very determined to let them search nearby. Port of Call. He was extremely worried at first, because according to information from Spain, British explorers seemed to have landed from the north side of the island. He commanded the fleet to sail along the west coast of New Zealand's North Island for 3 days, and actually saw the good harbour that His Highness said. Well, Joseph didn't know the specific location of Kafir Port, but he remembered that it was mentioned in the documentary that it was the port closest to the New Zealand ranching area. Under the command of Dufresne, the 5 ships of the Gemini Company slowly docked in a concave-shaped harbour, then put down the small boat, passed between 2 towering boulders on the shore, and stepped onto this mysterious island. As the leader of the twin colonization teams, only more than 600 people came this time. At first, the company only recruited less than 300 volunteers. After all, these islands in the South Pacific are notoriously desolate, and adventurers are not willing to come here to find opportunities. It was not until His Royal Highness the Crown Prince told the church that there were hundreds of thousands of people on the island, and that he would definitely accept Catholicism, that the situation changed. The church soon organized a large number of priests to colonize the island with the fleet at their own expense. Even their expenses were provided by the church. These days, finding a missionary destination with hundreds of thousands of people is extremely valuable resources. Maybe this credit will be his capital to compete for the archbishop in the future. So all major dioceses are almost breaking their heads in order to compete for places. Moreover, in order to win the support of the Gemini Company, the church even handed over the command of these priests to the company. The sailors quickly set up a simple camp on the beach and began to move the things on the ship to the shore. Dufresne, on the other hand, led an exploration team of less than 100 people towards the hinterland of the island to the east. The construction of the New Zealand colony, which was crucial to France, began at their feet. The group of people walked for a day and a half, and when they were approaching a rolling hill, they suddenly heard a high-pitched shout coming from a huge pando tree in front of them. Dufresne remembered His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's instructions and hurriedly ordered the exploration team to stop, and then motioned for the translator Tolman to step forward. Before they came here, they made a special trip to Tahiti and hired several locals who knew French there. It was colonized by Spain very early, and although there were few people who knew French, they could still find some. Tolman stepped forward and waved kindly to the brown-skinned strong man in the tree. After chattering for a while, and the other person replied a few more words, the translator turned to the expedition commander and said, "Sir, they asked us to use our guns. Let it all go." Dauphin couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Sure enough, as His Royal Highness the Crown Prince said, these natives were not rustic at all. Although almost all of them were naked, they knew that guns were dangerous items. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the British colonial process in New Zealand was extremely tortuous in history. As early as more than 100 years ago, the Spanish came to New Zealand and came into contact with the Maori, which exposed the latter to many new things. He is far from being a country bumpkin who has never seen the world. This makes them much more difficult to deal with than the Indians. They saw muskets and planted potatoes and sweet potatoes brought by the Spaniards. Sweet potatoes even became one of their staple foods. Dauphin ordered his men to put their weapons on the ground and then brought two assistants and a translator to contact the Maori. He had just taken more than 10 steps when dozens of strong Maori men with stone spears suddenly appeared from behind the surrounding weeds and low hills. Dauphin motioned to the team members not to move and asked the translator to speak loudly. "We are friends and we are here to do business with you." Seeing that the Maori leader showed no threatening behavior, he bravely stepped forward and put his nose towards the Aborigine according to what was written in His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's New Zealand guide. The latter was obviously stunned for a moment, but immediately he also leaned forward, touched his nose with his, and then let out a cheerful laugh. The surrounding Maori warriors smiled, and some even took the initiative to touch noses with members of the exploration team. Simple but effective traditional Maori etiquette immediately brought the relationship between the two parties closer. In the evening, the exploration team, led by Maori warriors, met the leader of the Hapu, the Maori tribe, here. After accepting Dauphin's gift of a soft wool blanket, the latter happily convened the tribe to hold a welcome celebration and entertained them with barbecue, seafood and sweet potatoes. The exploration team members strictly followed the requirements of the guide to interact with the Maori people. Then, under the leadership of the tribal leader, Dauphin trekked for 5 days to a Maori village that occupies an extremely large area and successfully met with the leader and high priest of Tenuiaiwa. The Maori was equivalent to a tribal alliance, and Tenuai was the largest tribal alliance in the North Island of New Zealand. Compared to the Dutch, who were beaten up by the Maoris and driven out of New Zealand decades ago, and the British, who invested a large number of soldiers and fleets decades later, but failed to defeat the Maoris, Dauphin is better. The trip couldn't be described as smooth. It was like a divine help. This is the terrifying power of poor information. Chapter 277, Common Prosperity. Dauphin familiarly gave some small gifts to Tenuwa Chief Tu and High Priest Matero, and the Maori people's attitude immediately became enthusiastic. After the two parties exchanged some unsmooth greetings through an interpreter, the Tahitian language is not exactly the same as the Maori. Dauphin directly stated the purpose of the trip to Tere. "Dear Chief, I'm here to purchase some land from you on behalf of His Majesty the King of France. As for what to pay for, you can choose weapons, clothing, furniture or even technology. I guarantee that you will definitely be satisfied with this transaction." Tere and the High Priest looked at each other, then looked at Dauphin with a smile. "How much land do you plan to buy?" Seeing that the other party did not seem to be resisting, the latter said to himself that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince still looked down upon these people, and they were still just ignorant natives. According to the usual routine of the colonists, just like the Spaniards used to trick the Indians, they can exchange for large tracts of land with worthless gadgets. He immediately replied, "If possible, I hope to purchase 50,000 acres in advance, and then continue to purchase depending on the situation." The translator communicated with the Maori leader about the unit acre for a long time, but Tere suddenly sneered, shook his head and said, "At most 500 acres, we need some muskets." Dauphin's face suddenly froze, and he hurriedly said, "You have so much useless land here. 50,000 acres is not worth mentioning to you. 500 acres, with 50,000 acres, we can provide the muskets you want. 500 acres, there is no other possibility." How could Dauphin know that the Maori had mastered farming and valued cultivated land very much? Wars for land often occurred between tribes, So how could they sell the land so easily? In fact, decades later, the British encountered the same problem and then had to spend a lot of time to send troops to persuade the stubborn Maori. Dauphin took a deep breath and hurriedly returned to the script given to him by the Dauphin. He showed a harmless smile. You may have misunderstood. What we need is not cultivated land, but uncultivated grassland. Teray still refused to let go, even on the barren grassland. Dauphin had no choice but to use his trump card. Your Excellency, Chief, what if the land I bought still belongs to you, and I only use it to raise sheep, and these lands are still managed by your tribe? Teray asked tentatively without responding. Then will you still provide me with a musket? Of course. Teray gestured to the assistant behind him, took an old-fashioned matchlock gun from him, and handed it to the Maori leader. 500 of these guns, as well as the matching 10,000 rounds of ammunition and gunpowder. I'd get 500 linen coats, skirts and 300 blankets in exchange for your 50,000 acres of wild grassland. Teray confirmed again in disbelief. The land does not belong to you, but my people can still set foot there. Completely correct. Tula is happy. What's the difference between this land and not selling it? Didn't he earn a lot of muskets, clothes, and blankets for nothing? Dauphin smiled and said, it's just that these 50,000 acres of land must be used to raise sheep. Oh, don't worry, I will provide the sheep. I just need help from your tribe to raise them. Oh, please don't worry, I will pay your people enough compensation, whether it is muskets or anything else. And these sheep are yours too. What? Teray's eyes almost popped out. Is there such a good thing in the world? Not only did they buy land for free, but they also gave sheep away for free. You even get paid for raising sheep. Dauphin continued, of course, you cannot slaughter these sheep at will, unless they are too old to produce wool. And your people must take good care of them. If any sheep are killed or injured, they must be deducted from their reward. And my only requirement is that all the wool produced must be sold to France. Yes, it is sold. After all, the sheep are yours. We will provide the corresponding materials to exchange for the wool. This was Joseph's New Zealand strategy. When the French Navy was completely unable to defeat the British, they wanted to establish a stable colony in the Pacific, and they were faced with Maori people who had seen the world, had explosive combat power, and were very united. They could only use one strategy point, that is to distribute benefits to Maori. The land is still yours, the sheep are yours, I pay the wages for raising the sheep, and I pay for the wool produced. If anyone refuses this, he is definitely a fool. This was the model commonly used by meat factories in later generations, providing farmers with piglets, and raising them all for me to buy. It's just that in New Zealand, whether it is land price, labor force or wool price, they are so cheap that they are almost negligible. As for New Zealand's natural conditions, even the indigenous people can easily raise sheep well. Everything is perfect. At the same time, France also formed a community of interests with the Maori and even armed them with compensation. When the British want to cause trouble, the fierce Maori will be enough for them to drink a pot. Although the Maori are still in the Stone Age, they have an extremely powerful weapon, the handkerchief. This is a military defense system. Usually built on high ground such as hills. The Maori will transform the mountain into a terraced plain, and then build fences and towers layer by layer. The former uses sharpened wooden piles, the latter uses stones, and is fixed with a large amount of flax. Then, behind the fence, trenches were dug, with a depth of up to 4 meters. In this way, after each fence was captured, the enemy had to face the deep ditch and the next fence. The best thing is that this kind of bunker, built almost by primitive people, actually has the innate ability to defend against cannons. Faced with artillery, the Maori would immediately hide in the trenches behind the stockades, and solid shells had no power against them. When the bombardment was over, they jumped out and fought hand to hand with the enemy. When the British sent troops to attack New Zealand in the mid-19th century, they suffered a big loss from these pars. Almost every par consumes thousands of artillery shells and takes an extremely long time. And after the British broke through the last tower of Par, the Maori would still escape through the tunnels dug in advance. Each Maori tribe has to repair several of these Pars They are found all over the mountains and plains of New Zealand. The British, who were stronger than they were in 1840, could only rely on deception to sign a colonial treaty with the Maori tribal leaders. Soon they were overwhelmed by the Maori uprising and finally had to agree to Maori autonomy. Therefore, for New Zealand, those who come hard cannot be a candidate at all. From the beginning, Joseph planned to let the Maori speak French, raise French sheep, and believe in French Catholicism, so that everyone would be prosperous together. As for Maori hooking up with the British, not to mention the sincerity and stubbornness of Maori people. After many years of operation, France's penetration and influence in New Zealand cannot be easily handled by the British. At the very least, Britain had to pay a price that was 10 to 8 times higher than the cost of colonizing New Zealand in history to be able to conquer this place. Chapter 278, the first colony in the Pacific. After the Maori chief repeatedly confirmed the details of the transaction with Dauphin and communicated with the high priest Matero to make sure there were no traps, he finally solemnly agreed to France's proposal to purchase the land. Moreover, the leader of Terre seemed to feel that the French were too sincere and that he was a little short-handed, so he agreed to sell Dauphin 1,000 acres of French land with full property rights, as long as it was a short distance from Taino. Don't be too close to the tribe, let him choose the location. Dauphin was overjoyed and asked for the place where he landed. A port can be built there in the future, and a town can be built further in. It will be very convenient to ship wool from the hinterland of New Zealand to France. The two parties negotiated the deal and immediately became much closer. Terre then went to order the tribesmen to prepare a ceremony to welcome the French guests. The priests brought by Dauphin had already chatted with the Maori high priest. Yes, there is the greatest god in the world, and he dominates everything. Macha raised his hands devoutly and said, "Io Macha Kor, we worship him, revere him, and give everything to him." A priest from Reims immediately smiled and nodded. "Dear Father Matro, in fact God's name is Jehovah, and he does dominate everything." The scheming priest saw that the Crown Prince's New Zealand guide mentioned that Maori people love facial tattoos, so he drew some lines on his face with a pen. Although in the eyes of Maori people the meaning of face tattoos is unclear, but it is indeed much more pleasing to the eye than those with fair faces. Matro looked at him and said, "How could this be? This is what our ancestors told us, and our ancestors will not be wrong, Father." Dietrich kept in mind the requirements in the guide and would never refute the Maori beliefs. Instead, he said, "You see, the names are different in different languages." He picked up the sweet potato on the table, like this. "You call it." The translator on the side immediately said the Maori word for sweet potato, "but we call it sweet potato." Dietrich continued, "And our names for God may have different pronunciations, but they definitely refer to that God." He looked at the high priest nervously until the latter nodded thoughtfully, and his heart suddenly felt relieved. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was indeed right. It seems that these Maori people are very likely to convert to Catholicism. The church's huge investment should not be a loss. This is something Joseph has seen on documentaries before. The Maori believe in a supreme god, and their religious theories are very primitive, so they can easily be fooled by Christianity, which has developed for nearly 2,000 years. Historically, the British colonists quickly convinced the Maori people to become Protestants. Now, the Maori people are bound to be captured by the Catholic Church. In the future, if the British want to seduce Maori, there will be another religious obstacle. Although Protestants and Catholics are both branches of Christianity, the hatred between them is much deeper than that between pagans. Sure enough, by noon the next day, Matero had already been tricked by several church veterans into making the sign of the cross on his chest. But he always believed that he had never changed his religious beliefs, but only learned more about God and God's deeds before the sun went down. The signing ceremony of the map sales and purchase agreement between Dauphin and the Terre chiefs officially began. The Maori people do not yet have writing, let alone paper. To sign a contract between them is usually to hold a ceremony similar to a sacrifice and draw some marks on the animal skin. Their reverence for their ancestors and their devotion to God ensured that they would never violate the contract. In other words, if any Maori violates it, he will be tolerated by all Maori. Tens of thousands of acres of land of the Tainu tribe were involved, so the ceremony was very grand, and almost all the tribesmen who could come came to watch. Dauphin also followed the traditions of the indigenous people and worked until about 9 o'clock in the evening, finally getting the purchase agreement for 50,000 acres of pasture and 1,000 acres of self-use land. Port Kafir readily handed over dozens of matchlock guns to the Maori as a deposit. Teray suddenly beamed, and his affection for these French friends increased a little more. A few days later, the French royal flag was planted at the place where Dauphin had landed, and the port, later known as Port Kafir, was named the new port of Marseille. Dauphin then led the exploration team non-stop to the central part of the North Island of New Zealand. Under the introduction of the Tuoi people, he met the leader of the Yatirei tribe. When Dauphin was surrounded by people from the Yatirei tribe a few days later, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Fortunately, he had taken over this colonization task and made a lot of money. The task was almost without difficulty. According to the current progresses, that it will take at most 2 months to finish all the large tribes in the North Island of New Zealand, and then we can just sit back and count the rewards at the same time. The construction of simple towns has also begun near the new Marseille port. The employees and priests of the Gemini Company are directing thousands of Maori indigenous people to level the ground after the burning. Not far away, there are a large number of neatly cut timber piled neatly, ready to be turned into houses at any time. These Maoris were not hired by the Gemini Company, but the tribal leaders were very fond of these French friends and sent their tribesmen to help. When Dauphin returned to the port of New Marseille more than a month later with a contract for nearly 300,000 acres of land, he could already see the bronze bell on the top of the newly built chapel from a distance. 3 flat rammed earth roads connect the docks. More than a dozen houses have been built on both sides of the road, and a large number of indigenous people and company employees are building new houses. A satisfied smile appeared on his face, and he began to imagine what kind of prosperity this place would become after the company sent thousands of hard workers in a few months. And, of course, there were sheep, of which the company's ships would bring plenty. They are the new owners of this island. Southeast France. Port of Toulon. As soon as Joseph got off the ship, an officer handed him the documents sent by the general staff. After sending away the officials who greeted him at the port, Joseph got on the carriage and opened the documents. The first item is that after evaluation, the general staff decided to mobilize 10,000 troops from Montpellier, Provence and other places to Tunisia to cooperate with the Milan army to stabilize the situation there. Nearly half of these 10,000 troops came from the newly reorganized Montcalm army. Now it has been renamed the Montpellier army, and the rest were from the Provence garrison. This is the first batch of troops deployed from the 2 provinces near the port of Toulon, based on the principle of proximity. The general staff plans to send an additional 10,000 troops to Tunisia later. Chapter 279, opening up the battlefield in South Asia. When Joseph saw the baggage list below and the cost of sending troops, he suddenly felt dizzy. The departure cost for the first batch of 10,000 horses alone exceeded 500,000 livres. This is only the cost of moving the troops from France to Tunisia. After they go, they will have to continuously supply food, grass and various consumables, which will cost at least 400,000 livres every month. If a battle breaks out, the cost will be incalculable. 1 million livres per month may not be enough. Joseph frowned. If you add the second batch of 10,000 soldiers in the Milan army, these troops will consume more than 10 million livres every year just by staying in Tunisia. He slapped the document hard on the small table. The British method was so disgusting. He worked hard to win Tunisia, but in the end he had to spend money to maintain stability. On the contrary, we can rely on steady management and, after cultivating the local Tunisian legions, hand over the defense work to them, but that will be at least 3 to 5 years later. Not to mention, during this period, the French would be less willing to go to Tunisia for reclamation because they were worried about a possible war in Tunisia. This will greatly slow down the development of Tunisia. So, is there any way to break the situation? Joseph frowned and thought hard. Convey benefits to Morocco and ask them to withdraw their troops. He immediately shook his head. This would only fatten Morocco's appetite, and the British would probably increase their stakes. Will France follow? Encourage Russia to pressure the Ottomans to abandon Tripoli? I'm afraid it's not very realistic either. Russia is currently engaged in the 7th Russo-Swedish War with Sweden, and the two sides will not have a result until the middle of next year. Prior to this, Russia had just signed an armistice treaty with the Ottomans, and Russia, which had taken advantage of it, was definitely not willing to start a war with the Ottomans again. Still unable to think of any effective countermeasures, Joseph couldn't help but rub his forehead and let out a long sigh. Why do such troublemakers as Britain exist in the world? A shit stirrer? Eamon, who was sitting opposite, was startled for a moment, then smiled knowingly. Your metaphor is too apt, Your Highness. This is indeed what the British are best at, so aspiring kings of France through the ages would have wanted to kick their ass. Joseph said in his heart, I really want to beat the British guy right now. Beat up the British? He suddenly thought of something. Yes. I was always thinking about how to defend against Tunisia. I was in a blind spot. I should take the initiative and beat the British. The great strategist once said, you fight yours, and I'll fight mine. We should not duel with them on the battlefield, prepared by the British, but should find their weak points and hit them hard point. As long as the British are hurt and have no time to worry about Algiers and Tripoli, isn't it easy to deal with these two small countries? After finding the way out, Joseph immediately took out the map, spread it on the small table, and then lay on it to search point North America. Nothing to work on. The United States is small and poor, and it keeps flirting with the British, so it's impossible to count on it. Caribbean Sea. Forget it. As long as it's a naval battle, the British still can't shake it for the time being. Australia. Britain has not invested much there, so even if it gives him a clean slate, it won't lose much money. India. When he saw this inverted triangular peninsula, Joseph's eyes suddenly lit up. The biggest jewel in the British crown. Right, I'll smash it for you. If I remember correctly, the Third Mysore War will break out at the end of this year. Historically, Tipu Sultan fought alone and was eventually defeated by the British and the Indian princes, and now he will have the support of his French friends. The Kingdom of Mysore in southwest India is the most powerful force on the subcontinent and has always been at odds with the British. In fact, any Indian prince with a bit of blood will be dissatisfied with the British policy of encroaching on India. Of course, the majority are bloodless Indian princes. In 1789, the Dutch East India Company was preparing to withdraw from India, so it sold 2 forts to the Maharaja of Travancore in southern India, but these 2 forts were in the territory of Mysore. Tipu, the Sultan of the Kingdom of Mysore, was furious after hearing the news. The Prince of Travancore never dealt with him. After negotiations were fruitless, Tipu Sultan led his army to attack the state of Travancore and soon occupied part of the adjacent territory of the two countries. Interestingly, Travancore still had a good relationship with France at this time, and France also lost many soldiers in this battle. Seeing that he could not defeat Mysore, the Maharaja of Travancore ran to the British for help. Cornwallis, the Indian governor of the East India Company, declared that the Indian princely states were under British protection. Mysore declared war on Travancore, which was a declaration of war on the East India Company. Soon, Cornwallis entangled the Maratha, Madras, Nizam and other princely states in India to jointly encircle and suppress the Kingdom of Mysore. Tipu Sultan led the Mysore army to fight against the British for 2.5 years. During this period, he also won some battles, but in the end he fell in front of the powerful offensive of the British and their minions. Since then, the entire subcontinent has no longer been able to threaten Britain, and has completely become the British back garden. Actually speaking, Tipu Sultan still has some chances in this battle. His father Hedal started training the new army 30 years ago, hired European officers, and developed a European-style army, including cavalry and artillery. Without the British, other Indian states would be far from his opponents. However, Tipu Sultan had a very serious problem. That is, he was not tolerant enough towards Hindus, which aroused the hostility of other Hindu princes at the same time. Tipu Sultan always wanted to defeat the British in one fell swoop, which made his use of troops too aggressive. But he forgot his greatest advantage, their ability to fight and delay in local operations. This led to his failure to stabilize the situation. After a series of early victories, he was attacked by the British and suffered a disastrous defeat. If France can provide some support to Mysore and send some officers, to help him avoid these mistakes. It will hopefully teach the British a lesson. Joseph was thinking and writing, and by the time the carriage arrived southeast of Montpellier, he had basically sorted out his thoughts. He put down his pen, smiled and breathed a sigh of relief. He wondered if the British were still interested in coming to Tunisia to stir up trouble after the fire in India. Immediately, he picked up the report from the General Staff Headquarters and continued to read it. After the content of adding troops to Tunisia, Berthier reported on the construction of some General Staff Headquarters. Generally speaking, this department has begun to operate. Recruitment and training are the first tasks to be carried out, followed by the expansion of the Paris Police Academy and the integration of other military academies. Chapter 280 The Young Emperor. In this series of affairs, the first few went very smoothly. For example, the Paris Police Academy has basically converted Joseph's manor into a training ground and purchased several hectares of land nearby, making it the largest military/police training base in France. Of course, the teaching staff is still far from enough. With the cooperation of the new Minister of War, the Duke of Broglie, this old nobleman worked very hard after turning to the royal family and being promoted to Minister of War. Many of his disciples and former officials agreed to teach at the Paris Police Academy. But for the current scale of the police academy, it is still a drop in the bucket. According to Duke Broglie, other military nobles still seemed to have illusions, believing that the royal family's military power was not enough to deal with all troubles, and they would have to be called upon sooner or later. So they continued to adopt a wait-and-see attitude. Joseph rubbed the armrest of the seat and frowned slightly. These hereditary officers were really stubborn. It seemed that he should pay more attention to this matter. Although his plan is to use the new army he has trained to shoulder the combat mission of the entire France and let the old army stay in the garrison to retire, it does not mean that he will give up the old army that France has trained for decades. Valuable resources, especially mid-level officers and cavalry, talents that require a lot of resources and time to cultivate, should be absorbed into the Guards Corps as much as possible for their own use. Historically, due to the collapse of the Great Order or the forced removal of a large number of nobles from the old army, most of the emperor's cavalry were civilians who lacked sufficient training. It is best for the cavalry to practice riding horses since childhood in order to truly become elites. This is something that poor civilians cannot do, so his cavalry team has been in disrepair, relying solely on the desperate energy brought by revolutionary enthusiasm to hold up the battlefield. If the emperor had an elite cavalry composed of nobles, not to mention a desperate comeback, he would at least be able to survive the siege for a few more years. Joseph is not too worried about absorbing talents from the old aristocracy. Soldiers are full of blood. In other words, he has no interest in those guys who lack blood. Therefore, we must try to arouse the bloody spirit of these noble officers, make them respect themselves, and be completely convinced by the Guards Corps, and they will naturally come to surrender with tears and shouts. After planning a plan to recruit noble officers, Joseph finally turned to the last part of the General Staff report. This is a list of people who have made meritorious service in the process of quelling the chaos. Their information and reasons for their meritorious service are also attached. Most of them were from the Guards Corps, and there were also some from the Moulins Corps and the Paris Corps. What made Joseph most curious was that there were actually a few people from the old army on the commendation list. Captain Marc Dimitri Barbely led his men to bravely protect the town hall when rioters in the Vendée tried to burn it down. Second Lieutenant Napoleon Beauharnais led 50 of his men to confront nearly 500 rioters in the town of Amiens, and finally dispersed the rioters. Joseph was startled when he saw this. The name Napoleon was very rare. Logically speaking, there shouldn't be people with the same name, but this person didn't have the surname Bonaparte. He hurriedly pulled out the information at the back and saw it read, Napoleon Beauharnais, born on August 15, 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica. His father is Carlo Maria di Beauharnais, a Corsican noble. There are 4 brothers in the family. He entered the Paris Military Academy in 1784 and graduated early in 1785. He currently belongs to Raphael and Valenciennes Artillery Regiment, temporary commander of the 2nd Company. Joseph suddenly became short of breath. If it was just the same name, it wouldn't matter. but since the military cadets who had been training for 1 year, their family circumstances, and even their father's name were completely matched, there was no way it was just the same name point this should be taking the emperor. He was immediately puzzled. Why was the emperor named Buonaparte? No wonder I searched all over France for Napoleon Bonaparte to no avail. It turned out that he didn't even match his last name point. But no matter what, when France needs to absorb more overseas interests, it finally found the emperor. This is definitely great news. With the emperor in hand, his confidence to lead France to conquer the European continent will instantly increase exponentially. When the convoy stopped in Vitrolles, Joseph immediately handed Napoleon's information to Emin and asked him to send someone to Valence to summon the second lieutenant. Emin was giving orders to the messenger, and Joseph suddenly remembered that the general staff seemed to have transferred Montpellier's army to Tunisia, and Valence was also affiliated with Montpellier. It was very likely that the emperor was also there in point, so he ordered Emin to leave a few people waiting at the port of Toulon and look for Napoleon and the army heading for Tunisia. The army was going to cross the Mediterranean and would surely board the ship in Toulon Point. However, what Joseph did not expect was that the messenger he sent came back the next afternoon, saying that he had met the army sent to Tunisia south of Montpellier. And Lieutenant Buonaparte was indeed among the team. So at 8 o'clock in the evening, there was a knock on the door of the villa where Joseph was temporarily staying. Emin whispered outside the house, "Your Highness, Second Lieutenant Buonaparte wants to see you." Joseph immediately said excitedly, "Please invite him in quickly." The door opened, and a young man wearing an old white military uniform, with a slightly thin face, a high nose, and nervous blue eyes walked in quickly and stood next to Emin, looking a little at a loss. It wasn't until Emin coughed that the young officer hurriedly took off his hat and bowed to Joseph. "It is a great honor for me to be summoned by you, Your Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Joseph went up to him and bowed in return. "You are a hero who resisted the riots. You don't have to be so reserved." He looked at the young Napoleon. He was not as fat as in common oil paintings, but his facial features were still very similar. After a pause, Joseph cautiously confirmed, "Do you have an older brother named Joseph and younger brothers named Lucien and Louis?" Napoleon was obviously surprised that the Dauphin was so familiar with his family members. He nodded quickly and added, "The youngest brother's name is Jérôme, Your Highness." "That's right." Joseph pulled Napoleon to sit down on the sofa and asked casually, "Is your mother in good health? Is she busy with the vineyard?" Napoleon nodded subconsciously. "Yes, Your Highness, she is very good. In order to reduce expenses, the vineyard does not hire many people." Joseph motioned to the teacup on the table, then looked at the artillery lieutenant with a smile and said, "I admire your heroic performance in the town of Am. In fact, I hope you can join the Royal Guards Corps." "Oh, according to your request this time for meritorious service, he will be promoted to captain and serve as artillery battery commander." "So, your answer?" Chapter 281 The Troublesome Corsican Zionists. Napoleon obviously did not expect that the Crown Prince was looking for him for this matter. He was stunned for a moment, stood up hurriedly, caressed his chest and said, "I'm very honored, Your Highness. I mean, of course I'm willing to join the Royal Guards Corps." Joseph couldn't help but find it quite interesting to see the nervous and reserved look in front of him of the Emperor Nahu, who was the most powerful man in history and turned Europe upside down. He also expected that the young Napoleon would not refuse his solicitation at this time. After all, his family still owed a large amount of money on the vineyard in Corsica, and they urgently needed him to make money to supplement their family income. Joseph was about to encourage Napoleon a few more words to bring the two of them closer, but he saw Napoleon blushing, as if he had summoned up the courage to say, "Your Highness, but I have one more request, and I hope you can grant it." "Oh, please tell me." "Well, I need to take 4 to 5 months of leave every year to return to Corsica." Napoleon obviously knew that the military discipline of the Royal Guards must be very strict, and it would be difficult for him to take leave at will like he did in Valence, so he had to say it directly. "No, my health is not very good, and I need regular treatment. In addition, I also need to go back and help take care of the vineyard at home." Joseph narrowed his eyes and thought that Napoleon seemed to have no serious illness except hemorrhoids. So what does he do? When he returns to Corsica every year, he suddenly remembered that the emperor at this time seemed to be a staunch Corsican Zionist. Under the call of Pascal Paoli, the leader of the Corsican independence movement, he often secretly participated in some political activities. Historically, Napoleon served as a soldier for 4 years before the Great Order, and he took nearly 3 years of leave to go to Corsica to participate in these things. Thanks to the chaotic management of the old French army at that time, no one noticed this. Joseph secretly sighed. It was not a problem for the emperor to be in the KO camp, and his heart was in the Han dynasty. He had to stop the idea of restoring Corsica as soon as possible. It's just that you can't rush this matter, otherwise it may be counterproductive. After all, young people in their 20s have a somewhat rebellious mentality. It would be great fun if the emperor was determined to join the restoration of Corsica and in turn become the enemy of France. Therefore, we must first stabilize the emperor and improve the relationship, and we will talk about the other things later. So Joseph nodded very generously and said, "Your health is the most important thing. Of course you can take leave. As for the vineyards in your hometown, I have some friends in Bordeaux. Maybe I can ask them to help take care of it." Napoleon originally thought that it would be rare for the crown prince to grant him 1 or 2 months of leave every year, but he unexpectedly agreed directly. Hearing the crown prince's caring words, he couldn't help but feel warm in his heart, and he hurriedly bowed and saluted again. "Thank you for your kindness and consideration. My brothers and I can take care of the vineyard. Oh, I will do my best to fight for the royal guards and use my military exploits to thank you for your appreciation." Joseph was very happy to put the emperor in his pocket for the time being. He took him to have dinner with him, and then Jean Quesote sent 2 guardsmen to send him back to Paris and directly report to the General Staff headquarters. As for Raphael's legion, he directly wrote a note and had it sent to Valence. Today's old French army is honest. As long as the officer himself has no objections, he can basically mobilize them at will. After the emperor left, Joseph came to the courtyard of the villa, looking at the stars in the distance, while blowing the cool night breeze of late spring, but thinking about how to eliminate Corsica's independent tendency. Not to mention giving up the emperor's idea of restoring Corsica. This island hanging outside the French mainland will have to be reorganized sooner or later, otherwise there will be trouble sooner or later. First of all, we have to try to get that Pascal Paoli. Without this guy inciting them from behind, the little nobles in Corsica will soon forget about the restoration of the country. But this guy has now gone to the UK. He only relies on publishing books and directing the Corsican nobles to do things by remote control. He rarely shows up. Maybe the intelligence bureau can think of something about this. The second step is to get rid of the Corsican parliament. After Louis XV bought Corsica, he had no intention of running it well, so he did not establish French civil rule there, but allowed the Corsican parliament to continue to exist. This resulted in Corsica having very great autonomy, and the guys in the parliament were even more worried about losing power. So they used all their strength to support Corsica's independence. In addition to these, it is also necessary to enhance France's national strength and thereby improve Corsica's economic level. Corsican people are living a stable life. Who is still willing to follow you to achieve independence? Only the strong France can make Napoleon identify with it. Over time, he will naturally integrate into France and become an out-and-out Frenchman. At that time, whoever dares to talk about dividing French territory will be the first to strongly oppose it. It's a bit funny to say that in history, it was the emperor who, after ascending to the throne, personally ordered to significantly restrict the power of the Corsican parliament and unify the Corsican administrative system, thereby ending the independence movement here. 9 days later, after a bumpy journey, Joseph's convoy finally entered Paris. On the carriage, he opened the latest newspaper sent by Emin and saw that the front page of Paris Business Times was the final of The Star of France is Coming. 50 contestants will go to the Palace of Versailles. He smiled and shook his head. In fact, there were 2 very important things today that had an impact far beyond the French star's game. The first thing is that the succession case of the Duke of Chartres has officially come to an end after a long trial. the Duke of Chartres inherited the entire estate of the Duke of Orleans, owed a total of 26 million livres in fines, and was officially declared bankrupt. A large number of properties, including the royal palace and the annuity of the Duke of Chartres, have been recovered by the French Reserve Bank to pay off debts. However, Her Majesty the Queen was soft-hearted and could not withstand the tearful offensive of the Duchess of Orleans, so she agreed to leave manor and hundreds of thousands of livres of property to the Duke of Chartres in order to maintain the minimum dignity of the nobles. But judging from the fact that the Duke of Chartres is currently infected with syphilis, he probably doesn't have many years to live. At the same time, the Duke of Orleans' property of more than 60 million livres has officially fallen into the hands of the French finance, and most of it is currently used to repay the national debt. Of course, as the largest holder of French government bonds, this money basically goes into the accounts of the Bank of France. The second important thing is that the hundreds of rioters who were arrested were officially sentenced, and most of them received the death penalty. Naturally, Joseph would not be merciful to these guys from gangs. However, under the huge influence of the French star, everyone in France was nervously staring at the 50 qualifying players, discussing their deeds and specialties, and betting a few sous on the final championship. The happy and forgetful French people had long forgotten the poor Duke of Orleans and the rioters facing execution. Chapter 282 Expansion of Paris. Joseph's carriage was still 3 or 4 kilometers away from the Palace of Versailles, and he found that there was already a sea of people nearby. Eamon glanced out the window and explained, "Your Highness, it will take 2 more days for the official start of the game. These people should have come from other places to watch the game. Normally, there is a strict dress code to enter the Palace of Versailles, but during the French Stars game, you can enter and exit the palace square at will, just like before on the king's birthday." As a result, a large number of ordinary people came to camp outside the square, waiting for the game to start. However, they will not feel bored, because due to the huge influence of the Star of France, vendors from all walks of life have already prepared stalls here. From snacks to fruits, from toys to shoes and hats, from painters to shoe repairmen, the open spaces on both sides of the road are densely packed and stretch for 7 or 8 kilometers. The sounds of hawking, music and the chatter of passers-by are endless, forming an impressive atmosphere. A huge open-air commercial street. Some business-minded people even set up hundreds of tents under the shade of trees to serve as temporary hotels. Brian was worried that too many people would cause trouble, so he sent palace guards to patrol the commercial street, giving it a downtown feel. Joseph looked at the bustling scene outside the car and couldn't help but feel something in his heart. Why not take advantage of the situation and build a commercial street or something here? As France continues to develop, the population of Paris is bound to increase, especially after the Fashion Week and the Metrology Standardization Conference. Not only more French petty nobles poured into Paris, but the number of foreigners settling here also continued to increase. Today, the permanent foreign population in Paris is close to 1,000, most of which are concentrated near the real estate projects supporting the Fashion Week, and tens of thousands of people come to live in Paris. What followed was a surge in demand for the expansion of Paris. The Palace of Versailles is isolated outside of Paris, which is very detrimental to the issuance of government orders and the royal family's image among the people. Joseph had long wanted to integrate Paris and Versailles, but now he saw a good opportunity. Especially with the completion of the wooden track from the Palace of Versailles to Paris, the basic conditions for integration are already in place, and this matter should be put on the agenda as soon as possible. The carriage stopped in the marble courtyard, and Joseph found that Queen Mary was not among the crowd who came to welcome him. Emma leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Your Highness, Her Majesty the Queen is probably angry with you." "Sure enough, the Queen's maid, de Benenac, pushed through the crowd and came quickly, saluting him. "Your Majesty, the Crown Prince, Her Majesty the Queen asked you to go to her as soon as you come back." After she finished speaking, she looked around again and warned in a low voice, "Your Highness, you are really too willful this time," and ran to North Africa privately. "I'm afraid you don't know that His Majesty is so worried that he can't sleep every day." Joseph rubbed his forehead helplessly. Why does it feel like a parent is scorning a child who ran out to play all night? He had no choice but to follow Countess de Bernenac to the Petit Trianon. When he entered the front hall, he saw Queen Mary standing in the room with her back to him. Joseph hurriedly stepped forward to salute and said with an earnest smile, "Mother, I'm back." Humph. Queen Mary raised her head at a 45-degree angle, not looking at him at all. "You still know how to come back?" "Of course." Joseph hurriedly leaned forward with a bright smile. "Ah, the most beautiful, smartest, and kindest mother in the world. I haven't seen you for almost a month. I miss you so much." "Really?" The Queen still raised her head and deliberately said with a straight face, "How dare you go to such a dangerous place privately? And you still coaxed me to say it was in China. Isn't Tunisia considered domestic now?" Joseph turned to Queen Mary, took her hands, and rubbed her face. "Look, didn't I come back safely?" he said. Then he turned around and gave Emma a wink. The latter immediately directed his men to move in several exquisite boxes and then opened them one by one. Joseph introduced with a smile, "Look, this is a Tunisian style skirt that I asked you, the best tailor in Tunisia, to design. This is a necklace made of pearls, a specialty of North Africa. I specially selected it for you. This scarf is." Seeing that Queen Mary remained unmoved with a straight face, Joseph sighed softly and had no choice but to take out his trump card. "Mother, guess who I got back for you?" "Who?" The Queen glanced at her son. "It's useless. Even if you ask for intercession, it won't work, Jean." "Huh? No matter who intercedes." The Queen suddenly stopped mid-sentence, widened her eyes, and said in shock, "Who are you talking about, Jean?" "De Valois Saint Remy." Joseph smiled. "That liar, Queen." Mary immediately grabbed her son's arm and widened her eyes. "Are you serious? How did you find her?" "Well, actually, this is what I went to Tunisia for." Joseph immediately told the story of catching the British spy in a more embellished way. However, in his story, he was originally aiming to exchange the spy for Jean of, "Ah, my sweetheart. Good boy, thank you so much." Queen Mary burst into tears when she heard that her son was in danger in order to get back the liar who had humiliated her from the British. "Liv, but you really shouldn't take such a big risk. There is even a war in Tripoli." "Joseph, your life is more important than everything else I have. That damn female liar is not worth the risk." "Ah, I'm so sad. I'm so touched that my son has grown up and is like a heroic knight, washing away my humiliation. I'm still blaming you." "Oh, I really shouldn't have done it." Joseph blushed a little and hurriedly broke away from the Queen's arms. He motioned to the maid to bring some cakes, puddings, etc., and then took out the red Tunisian dress inlaid with gold pieces and decorated with a lot of curves and blocked it in front of the Queen. "Mom, you must try this. It's very beautiful. It will definitely suit you very well." An hour later, Joseph, who had finally coaxed his mother, walked out of the little Trianon palace exhausted and went straight to the office of the Minister of Commerce Bailey, preparing to discuss with him the development of the area between Paris and the Palace of Versailles into a commercial center and things about the new scientific research area. However, he had gained something from Queen Mary's place just now. The Queen promised him that, as long as he brought the Swiss guards with him and said hello to her, he could go abroad at any time. After explaining the Paris expansion plan to Bailey, Joseph went to the office building of the General Staff without stopping. Due to the special nature of the General Staff headquarters, the office is located in a two-story building next to the Royal Ordnance Factory. Although the area is not large, it is extremely busy. Dozens of civilian officers carrying various materials were constantly shuttling between offices with different functions. From time to time, urging shouts came from the room, which was very different from the lazy scene in the traditional officer's office. When Berthier learned that the Crown Prince was coming, he hurriedly greeted him with several officers. Before they could salute, Joseph asked the question he was most concerned about. "Has the officer named Napoleon come to report?" The Chief of General Staff obviously did not expect the Crown Prince to care so much about the young captain, who had just been promoted. He was stunned for a moment, before nodding and said, "Yes, Your Highness. He came to report the day before yesterday. He is now affiliated with 1st Artillery Regiment, Royal Guards." Chapter 283. Follow the Strong. Joseph smiled happily. Now he has retained the Emperor, but as for his heart, Na Huang is only 20 years old now, and there will be plenty of time and opportunities to cultivate relationships in the future. He, Berthier and others entered the office of the Chief of General Staff, sat down on the chair at the head, and motioned to everyone. Everyone, please sit down. I have read the report sent by the General Staff headquarters before. You all have done an excellent job and got this place up and running in a very short time. Of course, most of this is due to Berthier. If his level of leading troops in battle is 70 points, then his ability as an auxiliary staff officer can definitely get 100 points. It's not that he can only score 100, but that the highest score is only 100. In this regard, he is definitely the most outstanding genius in France. Berthier and the officers immediately stood up and shouted, "It is our honor to serve His Majesty the King." Joseph motioned for everyone to sit down and continued. In addition to the basic recruitment and training work during this period, there are still many things that the General Staff needs to be busy with. The first thing is to conduct a whole army combat effectiveness assessment. All legions must participate. As long as they can meet the assessment standards, they can obtain the title of royal. Officers who perform well in the assessment will also be promoted. Berthier was a little surprised and said, "Your Highness, is this reward too heavy? I mean, this is just an assessment." Joseph smiled and shook his head. "No, if you know the assessment standards, you will think that this reward is very reasonable." Then, what are the assessment standards? Follow the daily training standards of the Guards Corps and slightly improve them. Any regiment that can do it will be considered qualified. When Berthier heard this, he immediately showed a knowing smile, looking at the whole of France, except for the Royal Guards Corps, even including the elite Swiss Guards, who can run 5 kilometers in 22 minutes, not to mention carrying 18 pounds. There are also shooting, formation, obstacle crossing, tactical coordination and other events later. Not to mention, whether those old style armies can meet the standards. They may have never even heard of some training events. A staff officer who was brought up from the Guards Corps next to him hesitated and said, "Your Highness, there should be no regiment that can pass the assessment. So, what is the significance of the assessment?" Good question. Joseph cast an approving look at him. "So after the assessment, they will definitely say no one can meet such standards. At this time, it is up to the guards to destroy their self-confidence. Tell them what the real elite is." Berthier and others suddenly had strange expressions on their faces. The Crown Prince must be too cruel. This means that the soldiers of other legions will always live in the shadow of the Guards Legion from now on. Joseph smiled again and said, "Remember to send application forms to those in the legion after the assessment." Berthier didn't respond. Application form. Well, the application form to join the Guards Corps. Remember that the review and approval must be strict. As long as you have talent and courage, waste must not enter the Guards Corps. "Yes, Your Highness." Joseph didn't think that this demonstration alone could convince the noble officers, but at least it could leave a deep mark on their hearts in the final analysis. To completely convince them, the Guards Corps must achieve impressive results on the battlefield. In the previous battle in Tunisia, the opponent was only a North African army whose equipment, training, and command were lagging behind the times. And the battle against the Montcalm Legion had an element of calculation. None of this convinced the arrogant French aristocratic officers. Only by facing a real European army and achieving an overwhelming victory can the powerful combat effectiveness of the Guards Corps be truly demonstrated. Soldiers respect the strong. As long as you are strong enough, they will naturally follow you. Just like taking the throne, whether he is establishing a republic or proclaiming himself emperor. Everyone from nobles to common people will follow him without hesitation. Even if he was exiled, he could still make countless soldiers cheer for his return. After discussing some details of the army's combat effectiveness assessment with the staff, Joseph continued, "Next we will talk about the situation in the Far East. I wonder if you have received the news that the Kingdom of Mysore in India had a dispute with the Dutch in the state of Travancore." Berthier and others looked at each other in confusion. An officer quickly left the conference room and returned not long after with a document. After the staff circulated the document, they all looked at His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in surprise. That was intelligence sent just 2 days ago from Pondicherry, India. saying that there was a possibility of conflict in the princely states in southwestern India, and the Dutch were involved in it. As for details, nothing was mentioned. But His Royal Highness the Crown Prince knows everything about what is going on there. Could it be that the Intelligence Bureau has already reached out to the Far East? Of course Joseph would not explain it to them, and it was unclear. The Intelligence Bureau has barely managed North Africa now. Even the Americas have only just begun to penetrate. Naturally, the Far East is a no-brainer at present. The information on the Far East is provided by businessmen and diplomats, so the content is very vague. Only he, the one who opened the game, knew the details. Joseph also glanced at the military intelligence and had to introduce the situation in Mysore to the staff first. The cause of the matter was that the Prince of Travancore purchased 2 fortresses in the territory of Mysore. That's probably what happened. Tipu Sultan of Mysore has always been strong. He would never allow rival prince to hammer 2 nails under his nose, so I think it is highly likely that he will go to war with Travancore. One staff officer mused, Travancore has our interests, and perhaps we should support it. Joseph shook his head. On the contrary, Mr. Major, Travancore was by no means a match for Mysore, and they were bound to seek help from the British. The British have long disliked Mysore. It is the only kingdom in India that has not surrendered to them, so they will definitely take this opportunity to declare war on Mysore. He looked around at everyone. Our interests in Travancore are simply insignificant. We even only exist in the entire Far East and have no interests at all, so our goal should be to consume as many British people as possible in the Far East. That said, we will support Mysuru. The staff officers looked at each other again and nodded slowly. Berthier said with some hesitation, Your Highness, if we directly send troops, it is likely to trigger a full-scale war from Britain against us. Joseph nodded. So, we must hide ourselves as much as possible. The main thing is to assist Mysore with weapons and equipment. Try not to use French weapons, and send officers. As for the army, you can choose a small number of Tunisians who have the same religious beliefs as the Mysore people. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 284, Opening a New Curtain. Not because of cowardice, but because the French Navy is really no match for the British. In order to support the independence of the United States, the French fleet bravely fought with the British in the Caribbean. As a result, they were beaten like dogs, resulting in the loss of a large amount of control of the Caribbean. In the end, in order to keep the sugar-producing base of Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti, they had to exchange more than 10 times the area of North American land with the British. Joseph would not make this mistake again in support of Mysore. The purpose of exerting force in India is to consume the British, not to consume ourselves. The most important thing for France right now is to develop industry. Startup funds for a large number of industries such as steel, coal, textiles, and steam engines have already been thrown in. At a time when massive investment is needed for industrial expansion, industrial stagnation must not be caused by wasting money on wars. After all, France's finances are still in bad shape. If he could be as wealthy as the British, Joseph wouldn't mind playing big in India. Berthier suggested, Your Highness, if only limited assistance is provided, then what the Mysore people need most is an excellent commander. Perhaps Major Lefebvre or Lieutenant Colonel Davout can be sent to India. The Lieutenant Colonel Davout he was referring to was André Davout, the commander of the Moulins Corps. Joseph thought and shook his head. These 2 men were indeed qualified commanders. They should be more than enough to fight against the British Cornwallis. However, the Mysore war would involve almost half of India. In addition to the remote location, it can be said to be extremely dangerous. He doesn't want his close relatives to do anything bad in India. But who else could be sent? There aren't many old noble officers who can really fight, and I don't know them well enough. He suddenly thought of a name and immediately looked at Berthier. Do you think it is possible to let Marquis Lafayette go to Mysore? Lafayette, a French officer, smuggled himself to the United States to participate in the Revolutionary War in 1777, and became a major general in the Continental Army. Even George Washington respected him. In 1780, he played an important role in the Battle of Yorktown and helped the Americans defeat the British point. After returning to France, he was awarded the rank of brigadier general, but because he was a liberal and was not favored by the French military aristocracy, he was never reused. Until the outbreak of the Great Revolution, he served as the commander of the National Guards. He was regarded as the highest military officer in France at the time, and he was unparalleled. But in the end, because of his greed for power and his insistence on protecting the king, he eventually fell out with the Jacobins and fled abroad. It was a very coincidental fact that Lafayette had fought against Cornwallis, the current Governor General of India, in the United States. The latter had never taken advantage of him, which would give him a considerable advantage when fighting the British. Psychological advantage. Berthier and other staff members discussed in low voices for a while, then turned to the Crown Prince and said, "Your Highness, the Marquis Lafayette's ability to command operations is undoubtedly beyond doubt, but he is probably unwilling to take risks in the Far East." He put it more tactfully. Lafayette was reprimanded by the royal family for going to the United States privately, and he had an unpleasant quarrel with the military, so he would most likely not listen to the orders of the general staff. Joseph smiled slightly. You can tell him that, as long as he can help miss or win, just like what he did in the United States, when he comes back, he can be promoted to assistant to the Minister of War, or governor of a certain province. I believe he will definitely accept this task. Joseph knew that Lafayette was a very power-hungry and ambitious man. He fought in the United States for several years. After returning to France, except for the rank of brigadier general, he did not receive any actual award, so, as long as you give him a chance to rise, he will definitely not refuse. And what Joseph gave him was actually a blank check. Although the kingdom of Mysore was quite powerful in India, Britain was heading towards a powerful empire on which the sun never set. It would be very difficult for Tipu Sultan of Mysore to be able to deal with the British for a few more years, and victory would be almost impossible. Of course, if Lafayette's small universe really exploded and defeated the British in the Far East, there would be nothing wrong with him being an assistant to the Minister of War. You know, that is equivalent to destroying the biggest job of the British. Berthier quickly wrote down the Crown Prince's order in his notebook, nodded and said, "Yes, Your Highness. I will try my best to persuade the Marquis Lafayette." Afterwards, Joseph discussed Tunisia's military deployment with his staff until the sky darkened, which ended the meeting. Returning to his bedroom, Joseph was so tired that he didn't even bother to take off his clothes, so he fell on the bed and fell asleep. After returning from Tunisia, he was bumpy on the road for 8 or 9 days, and finally he was able to take a good rest. Upon seeing this, Perna and Emin looked at each other, stepped forward and carefully touched the Crown Prince's forehead and wrist, to make sure he was not sick. Then she and the maid gently placed him on the bed, and covered him with a quilt, and then slowly retreated. The candle goes out. Joseph, who was sleeping soundly, had a dream. In the dream, the European continent turned into an endless theater, and the huge curtain stretching to the skyline was slowly opened under the gaze of the gods. Amsterdam, the Netherlands. The second floor of the Provisional Parliament building. The British Foreign Secretary, the Marquis Wellesley, looked at this simple building, and said to the Dutch speaker Campbellen, "I still prefer the Earl's Castle in The Hague, where people can feel the majesty and solemnity at any time." The Count's Castle he mentioned was the former Dutch Parliament building. After the Patriot Party gained power in the Netherlands, it moved the Parliament to Amsterdam. Due to the rush, the new Parliament building had not yet been built, so this building was used as the temporary office of the Parliament. Campbellen frowned slightly. The British obviously meant that Amsterdam was not majestic and solemn enough, but he immediately put on a smile. "The Hague is a thing of the past, Lord Marquis, and we will soon have it. The new Parliament building, you see, is just 2 streets away, and is no worse than the Count's Castle." The Marquis of Wellesley smiled indifferently, followed Campbellen into the living room, and sat down on the sofa. "Well, maybe you and your Parliament don't have to rush to propose a parliamentary building in Amsterdam." Campbellen immediately thought of William V, who had been deprived of power. "What do you mean by this?" "Oh, don't get me wrong." Marquis Wellesley waved his hand. "I mean, maybe the Dutch Parliament will soon renegotiate the address of the Parliament with the voters of the Southern Netherlands. You see, Brussels is actually a good place. the place. A strange look flashed in Campbellan's eyes. My lord Marquis, I don't quite understand what you mean. With Brabant making such a fuss, doesn't the Dutch Parliament have any plans? This book is released for the first time, providing you with a reading experience with no wrong chapters, and no out of order chapters. Chapter 285 Brabant Uprising. When Campbellan heard the word Brabant, he sat up straight and winked at the Dutch diplomat on the side. The latter immediately signaled all the servants to leave and closed the door tightly. Only then did Campbellan cautiously say, "Your Majesty the Marquis, in fact, the riots in Brabant have nothing to do with the Netherlands." The British Foreign Secretary nodded. "Yes, it doesn't matter. Van der Noot does not have the support of the Dutch Parliament." The Van der Noot he was talking about was the leader of the Brabant uprising. Brabant was a core region of the southern Netherlands, which would later become Belgium, and a huge riot was taking place at this time. At this time, the southern Netherlands was still an Austrian territory, but it had previously implemented a relatively independent political model, with the southern Netherlands parliament managing daily affairs here. The Austrian Emperor Joseph II began to implement a series of reforms a few years ago, including strengthening centralization and weakening the privileges of the nobility. This offended almost all the forces in the southern Netherlands. The liberals opposed centralization and demanded the continued maintenance of parliamentary rights. The conservative nobles were extremely dissatisfied with the weakening of privileges, so the two sides joined forces and began to organize the forces of the southern Netherlands, preparing to drive the Austrian forces out of here and establish a country of their own. Historically, this event was known as the Brabant Rebellion. Another name for the Netherlands is Northern Netherlands. As a country with the same origin as the Southern Netherlands, the Netherlands naturally hoped that the brothers could get rid of Austrian rule, so they secretly provided a lot of support to the rebels. Marquis Wellesley glanced at the expression of the Dutch speaker and continued, "Don't be nervous. I'm here to inform you of the attitude of the British Parliament. We believe that Southern Netherlands has every right to choose where it belongs, but you also know that Van der Noot alone is unable to deal with the powerful Austria." Campbell stared at the British man. "Please go on. They need the backing of their compatriots." The Marquis of Wellesley clasped his hands together to defend against the Austrians as the Republic of the Netherlands. Campbellan's breathing quickened. "You mean the UK supports the unification of the Netherlands and the Southern Netherlands?" Marquis Wellesley nodded. "We have always been the most loyal ally of the Netherlands. Naturally, we hope that the Netherlands will become stronger, so the unification of the lowlands is the first step." He completely failed to mention that the Anglo-Dutch War had just occurred a few years ago, and the British Navy almost destroyed the Dutch fleet. In fact, Britain has always regarded the Netherlands and Belgium as a springboard for the European continent to attack Britain, so it pursues a policy of firmly controlling them. Previously, the French supported the Dutch Patriot Party to oust William V from power. And then the Netherlands became pro-French, which made the British feel anxious. Now that there was the Brabant Uprising, Britain immediately used this as a starting point to win over the Netherlands. Unification? Campbellan seemed a little hesitant. "Will the people of the southern Netherlands agree?" The Marquis of Wellesley laughed. "If they want to get rid of Austria, they can only choose to merge with the Netherlands. Van der Noot has been seeking help from Prussia. To be precise, without the Prussian army entering the southern Netherlands, Austria could easily suppress the rebellion. And I have already talked about this with His Majesty Wilhelm II, and he very supportive of the reunification of the Netherlands." Campbellan immediately stood up and said excitedly, "Thank you and His Majesty William II. The people of the Netherlands will remember the strong friendship between our three countries." The Marquis of Wellesley suddenly changed the topic. "I heard that the Dutch East India Company is preparing to cooperate with the French to form a united East India Company." Campbellan immediately shook his head. "This is just wishful thinking of the French, and we never agreed." "Alliance?" Campbellan was stunned for a moment, then immediately reacted. "Yes, the Three Kingdoms Alliance. This is exactly what the Netherlands has been looking forward to." A meaningful smile flashed across Marquis Wellesley's lips. He knew that his strategy would be successful. Unifying the northern and southern Netherlands has been the dream of all Dutch people for hundreds of years. For this, they are willing to give up everything. For Prussia, they will do anything that can weaken Austria without hesitation. As long as the southern Netherlands did not belong to Austria, they did not care whether it was independent or unified with the Netherlands. The southern Netherlands controls the mouth of the Rhine River, and most of Austria's land is inland. If you want to conduct overseas trade, you can first go south to the Mediterranean, and secondly, ship through the Rhine River and go west to the Atlantic Ocean. Now Britain controls the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway to and from the Mediterranean. If it controls the mouth of the Rhine through the Netherlands, it will completely block Austria's maritime trade channels. When the time comes, there will be no need to worry about Austria not bowing to Britain. At the same time, in the Schönbrunn Palace in Austria, Joseph II listened to the report of Minister of State Kaunitz, took a deep breath, and said in a hoarse voice, "The reform must not stop. Paris has carried out more radical reforms than us, and there have been no problems. I'm confident. As for Brabant, they only have a few thousand poorly trained militiamen. Just let General Wilmser quell the rebellion as soon as possible." Kaunitz frowned and said, "Your Majesty, the Prussians will definitely not miss this opportunity to attack us, so what we have to face is more than just a few thousand militiamen." Joseph II leaned against the back of his chair. His poor health made it difficult for him to concentrate and think. After a moment, he finally said, "Give General Wilmser 30,000 troops. If the Prussians dare to interfere, attack them." Kaunitz was silent for a few seconds, then tentatively said, "Your Majesty, maybe we can ask your sister for help." The sister of Joseph II is Marie Antoinette, the current Queen of France. The corner of Joseph II's mouth curled up, as if he was smiling. "My dear brother-in-law has always been thinking about Wallonia, but you actually let the French army set foot in the southern Netherlands. This matter must be resolved by ourselves. If Austria can't even deal with a Brabant riot, then why talk about unifying Germany?" The Walloon region he was talking about is a large region in the southern part of the southern Netherlands, accounting for nearly half of the area of the southern Netherlands. The residents basically speak French, and are generally very pro-French. Kaunitz sighed helplessly, and thought to himself, if His Majesty had not pushed for radical reforms, the rebellion in the southern Netherlands would not have been provoked. Nowadays, the nobles are causing public dissatisfaction everywhere because of the reform. Austria is at its weakest. I hope it can get through the difficulties smoothly this time. He bowed to Joseph II. "Yes, Your Majesty, I will go and discuss with General Wilmser about sending troops." Palace of Versailles. The final of the Star of France officially began, and the entire Palace of Versailles square was packed with tens of thousands of people. People kept shouting the names of the players they supported, and the shouts of vendors made the whole square very lively. This book is released for the first time, providing you with a reading experience with no wrong chapters, and no out of order chapters. Chapter 286. Happy French people. Joseph rubbed his ears, put down the France-Austria trade agreement draft in his hand, frowned and looked at the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. The windows were closed, but they still couldn't block that tsunami of cheers coming from the square of the Palace of Versailles. He then remembered that today was the day of the French Star Finals, and had no choice but to shake his head and stand up. It seemed that he had to go to the Tuileries Palace if he wanted to work. Eamon walked over quickly, bowed and said, "Your Highness, Her Majesty the Queen has sent someone to hurry you up. The game is about to begin." Joseph nodded, stretched, asked the servant to help him change his clothes, and hurried towards the square. "Since I can't do anything else, I just go watch the game with my mother. She likes this kind of activity the most." When he walked out of the gate of the Palace of Versailles, he heard noisy voices coming from the marble courtyard. "No, we need to add some emotion. Especially the part where my father died. At that time, my father had to work 5 jobs a day so that I could continue dancing. He couldn't go to bed until 12 o'clock in the evening, and had to go to the workshop at 5 o'clock in the morning. Although I have no right hand, no family, and no friends, I still have singing voice, and singing is everything to me. Really. I heard the voice of God that day, so I regained my confidence, bravely returned to the promotion competition, and finally succeeded. Thank God." Joseph smiled and shook his head. He knew that these were the contestants who were about to compete, and the marble courtyard was now used as their preparation area point. In order to maximize the topical effect of the competition, he previously specifically asked all contestants to tell a story about themselves before the competition. The more sensational the better. What he didn't expect was that the French in the 18th century were very perceptive. After just a few rounds of competition, everyone discovered the importance of pre-match stories. When two people are close in singing and dancing, they rely on the degree of sensationalism of the story, determining victory or defeat. Even if the story is touching enough, it is more important than strength. As a result, the stories of the players became more and more exciting, and it is said that some dramatists have begun to make money by writing pre-match stories for people. This has also greatly increased the popularity of the game. Now the event is not only popular all over France, but almost all of Europe is talking about it. The French Star Organizing Committee has even compiled the stories of these players into a book for sale. The promotion version has been published for 3 issues, and the sales volume is amazing. Temporary wooden auditoriums formed a ring surrounding the tall stage in the center of Versailles Square. According to the design, there are more than 5,000 seats here. At this time, 2 people were squeezed into each seat, but most of the audience was still standing on the periphery, stretching their necks to look at the stage point. In order to cooperate with the French Star competition, the Paris City Hall also specifically required all workshops and stores to give employees at least 1 day off during the 3-day finals. This significantly increased the number of viewers. Joseph came to the VIP area of the auditorium through the path opened by the guards. Among the crowd, people along the way learned that the Crown Prince was coming and bowed to him. Joseph sat down next to Queen Mary and casually chatted with his mother about the match. He couldn't help but think of the last time he and Clementine watched the sword fight on Louis XVI's birthday. Suddenly he realized that there was a little girl on this occasion. The chatter on the side seems to be enough atmosphere. However, his cousin's return to Austria also made him relieved. He was really afraid that the Queen would force the relationship and get him a close relative. For him who is familiar with modern genetics, that is definitely a huge disaster in life. A loud sound of trumpets sounded all around, accompanied by drums and piano sounds. Louis XVI's sister-in-law, the Countess of Provence, came to the center of the stage and announced that the final of the Star of France had officially begun. Then the host talked about the twists and turns of the promotion competition and encouraged the players to perform at their best. There were hundreds of reporters from various countries in the stands, desperately recording the game in their notebooks. Now this competition is the focus of public opinion. Whoever newspaper sends back articles the fastest will sell the highest newspaper. The French people who came to watch the game were so excited that they couldn't help cheering, or they were moved to tears by the players, and they were completely integrated into a carnival feast. All the hard work and anguish in daily life were completely forgotten at this moment. In fact, since the preliminaries 2 months ago, their lives have been filled with various contestants and well-received songs and dances. It can be said that during this period, the French people were the happiest group in Europe. Now, unless they are about to starve to death, even if someone incites them to commit suicide, they will not pay attention at all. Joseph looked at the young people singing and dancing on the stage, and then glanced at the tens of thousands of mesmerized citizens around him. He couldn't help but nodded secretly. The routine of national entertainment in later generations was really effective. He immediately thought about whether he should continue to hold an all-French games or even an all-European games after the end of France Star. It can even boost the economy. He immediately reviewed the current sports: horse riding, sword fighting, tennis, golf. It seems that they are all aristocratic sports, so cricket can be promoted among the people. He heaved a sigh of relief. Okay, it seems that he has to invent football. However, for people of this era, footballs sewn with cowhide are still not affordable for ordinary people. Joseph planned in his mind that he could use some money from the finance department to purchase public footballs for each parish for everyone to use. A smile appeared on his lips. In this case, he might still be able to see his beloved World Cup in the 18th century. Well, can the French Ligue 1 also appear in advance? You can even form a professional team yourself. Paris Dauphin? Thinking about it, I'm a little excited. In addition to the selection, and awarding of the Louis Prize that has been included on the agenda, as well as the new Paris Fashion Week, etc. There are almost a variety of events in France this year. Joseph suddenly slapped his thigh. Well, if this happens, the housing prices in Paris will definitely rise again, and new real estate projects must be arranged quickly. It can be combined with the Paris Versailles integrated project to develop the wasteland between the two. This is all money. 3 days later the French star competition has come to an end, and Aurélien Tourner, a civilian boy from Brittany, finally won the championship. The runner-up was a businessman from Paris, and the third runner-up was a clerk from Bordeaux. It's not that the commoners are very strong, but that most of the nobles are arrogant and don't want to compete with the commoners, so they didn't sign up to participate. However, when the nobles of the Palace of Versailles saw that Tourner was presented with a trophy and a bonus of 30,000 livres by the Countess of Provence amidst the cheers of thousands of people, and joined the palace band, they all felt extremely regretful and silently decided in their hearts that they must participate. Next year's Star of France is the face of any nobleman worth 30,000 livres. Reminder, share this website reading S on Facebook. Please move your fingers so that we can continue to operate. Chapter 287. The real core of the French cabinet. East Palace of Versailles, Conference Hall. Queen Mary, who is sitting at the head of the conference table, is obviously in a good mood. On the one hand, the singing and dancing competitions in the past few days have made her very relaxed, but the most important reason is that the Foreign Secretary sent back a report yesterday that the British government has agreed to arrest Jean and send her back. France. In the future, we will finally no longer hear anything disgusting about the French royal family written by that liar. Before the cabinet meeting officially started, she looked at the Crown Prince and said, "Joseph, have you heard about what happened in Spain?" Joseph quickly changed his sad expression. "May the old king enjoy eternal peace in heaven." Yes, King Carlos III of Spain passed away not long ago. Queen Mary made the sign of the cross on her chest and sighed, "May God have mercy on him." By the way, please go to Madrid recently and congratulate His Majesty Carlos IV on his coronation for me and your father. Carlos IV is the crown prince who was tricked by his wife. Joseph once helped him deal with adulterers, which can be said to have a lot of history. Moreover, the Spanish royal family and the French royal family belong to the same Bourbon lineage, so they should express their congratulations to the new king very formally on his succession. Joseph nodded. "Okay, mother. I'll leave tomorrow." In fact, he was planning to go to Spain sometime. Not only Spain, but also all major European countries. He is planning to visit. With the rapid development of French industry, he needs to make arrangements in advance and sign trade agreements with various countries to pave the way for the sales of French industrial products immediately. Queen Mary signaled to Archbishop Brian, "Please start." "Yes, Your Majesty." The latter bowed and saluted, and then looked at the cabinet ministers at the conference table. "As Her Majesty the Queen just said, His Majesty Carlos IV has been crowned, and we need to prepare a diplomatic mission to accompany His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to visit Spain. At the same time, some policies with Spain also need to be adjusted in advance. The royal families of France and Spain are close relatives, and the interests of the two countries are relatively consistent. They are almost in a semi-alliance. Most of the policies will continue to be the same as those of Carlos III, so this topic ended quickly. Later, Archbishop Brian added, "Next, we have to discuss the situation about Osman. I believe you all know that Hamid passed away earlier this month. He had previously designated his nephew Selim III as the new Ottoman Sultan. During the succession of Selim III, the Ottomans were expected to experience a period of instability. Duke Broy, Minister of War, immediately said, "We can take this opportunity to find the heir of Ali I of Tripoli and send troops to support him in retaking Tripoli." Ali I was the Pasha of the Karamanli dynasty who had been overthrown by the Ottoman officer Benjir in a coup not long ago. When several cabinet ministers heard this, they all nodded in agreement. Tunisia can be said to have been taken from Ottoman hands. Now that Tripoli is under Ottoman control, it has always been a serious threat to Tunisia. For this reason, France has to maintain a large number of troops in Tunisia. Instead of wasting so much, it is better to take advantage of the internal instability in the Ottomans and solve this problem directly. Joseph immediately objected, but I'm afraid it's not the best strategy, Queen. Mary was about to ask her son why, but found that the ministers who had enthusiastically supported sending troops just now fell silent, and seemed to have never mentioned the matter at all. She looked at Joseph in surprise. Ahem. Can you tell me the reason? Yes, Your Majesty. Joseph said, there is a shadow of the British behind Tripoli, and they must really want us to get involved in the melee there. And if the Ottomans can use the British Navy to increase their troops, it will be difficult for us to stop it. It will be easy to win protracted war. The most important thing is that, even if we drive away the Ottomans, we can't occupy Tripoli. You know, European countries will be wary of our presence in the Mediterranean. Please, rest assured that I have made arrangements for this. The Ottomans are even further away from Tripoli than we are. As long as there is no British support, they will retreat from there soon. Joseph looked at Duke Broy. Maintaining an army in Tunisia for a short period of time is much less expensive than launching a war. Yes, that's right, Your Highness, Queen. Mary was still a little hesitant. What is the deployment you are talking about? Joseph smiled slightly. I will submit a report to you later. The Ottoman matter was put aside for the time being, and Archbishop Briand immediately brought up the bill proposed by Mirabeau, the Minister of Industry, to cancel tariffs between various parts of France, and to reform the tax collector system. Of course, both of these things were what Joseph ordered Mirabeau to do. Now that the French Reserve Bank has tens of millions of livres obtained from the Duke of Orleans, it has the confidence to carry out reforms. In these matters the capital aristocracy represented by Mirabeau naturally welcomed this. Eliminating tariffs between various places will make the flow of goods smoother, which is equivalent to expanding the market. Among the three major elements of industrial development, capital, technology and market, the market is the most important. It can even be said that with the market, two other things will emerge. As for the tax collector system, it is a stubborn financial problem in France, swallowing up a large amount of tax revenue every year. However, when Briand proposed these two reform bills, except for Mirabeau and Bailly, the other ministers opposed them more than in favor. Joseph was not surprised by this. After all, this was a reform that involved a lot. Local taxes not only involve the finances of provincial governments, but also the development of handicraft industries in various places. In the past, the handicraft industry here was weaker and could be protected by tariffs. After the tariffs are removed, you will have to face competition from all France. Most of these workshops with low productivity levels went bankrupt, triggering a wave of unemployment. The problem with tax collectors is even greater. The government's tax department has poor capabilities and serious corruption. If the tax collection work is handed over directly to them, the French government will go bankrupt next year, because the tax collected may even be cut in half. So Joseph asked Mirabeau to bring up these things, just to warm up, and let all walks of life know that this was happening, so as to make some preparations in advance. As expected, after more than an hour of debate, Queen Mary reluctantly announced that she would temporarily shelve the two bills. Archbishop Briand also breathed a sigh of relief, and then moved on to the last matter. There has been a serious rebellion in the southern Netherlands recently, and thugs surrounded the governor's palace and drove Austrian officials out of Brabant. Vienna has not responded yet, but we should make some arrangements in advance. The reason why he put this matter at the end was entirely because he thought it was insignificant. Riots are very common in Europe today, and one broke out in France not long ago. It is recommended that you go to read the latest chapters of this book, so that you can experience an extraordinary experience without errors or disorder. Chapter 288. What kind of feelings are discussed between countries? After hearing this, Queen Mary immediately looked at Archbishop Briand. My brother is suffering from illness, and this is what happened in the southern Netherlands. I think we should help him deal with the rebellion. She crossed her arms and thought, the Dutch should have a lot of influence on the southern Netherlands, and we have always supported the Dutch Patriot Party. Now it is time for them to reciprocate. Archbishop Briand nodded immediately. Of course it is possible, Your Majesty, but in fact, I think His Majesty Joseph II can easily suppress the thousands of thugs in Brabant. Joseph frowned as he recalled the information about the Brabant uprising. This is not a rebellion that Austria can easily resolve. Historically, Britain, Prussia, and the Netherlands quickly intervened in this chaos, and then an uprising broke out in Liège in the eastern part of the southern Netherlands. There were more than 20,000 rebels in the southern Netherlands alone, plus the combat effectiveness of the Prussian intervention force and the large amount of funds provided by the Netherlands cannot be underestimated. The reality is that the Austrian counter-rebellion army encountered a fierce battle as soon as it entered the southern Netherlands, and was eventually almost wiped out by the Prussian and Nepalese coalition forces. The Austrian commander had no choice but to withdraw to Luxembourg fortification, and urgently requested help from Vienna. At that time, Joseph II passed away, and the newly enthroned Leopold II saw that the situation was not good, so he had to cancel the reform measures of his brother Joseph II in order to stabilize the situation in the southern Netherlands and the country. Later, Leopold II delivered many benefits to the Hungarians under his rule, including completely rolling back the reform measures here, and finally won the support of the Hungarian nobles. Soon after, Austria assembled almost all the troops in Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, and Galicia, a total of 180,000 troops, as well as more than 10,000 troops of the Archduke of Bavaria, and marched to South Netherland in a mighty manner. On the Prussian side, King William II also handed over more than 100,000 Prussian troops to the Duke of Brunswick, and roped in Saxony, Mainz, Hesse and other countries to form a coalition army with a total of 150,000 troops, determined to intervene. The situation in the southern Netherlands. Wilhelm II even asked newly aligned Poland to send troops to reinforce the southern Netherlands. Prince Poniatowski prepared 30,000 troops, but he hesitated to send troops because he did not want to offend Austria. Even so, the southern Netherlands rebels plus the Prussian coalition were as numerous as the Austrian army. At the end of 1790, a large-scale fierce battle broke out between the two sides. At that time, all European countries believed that this would be the beginning of another 7 years war. However, just as the war became more intense, internal strife broke out between the conservatives and liberals in the southern Netherlands rebels. In the end, the liberal Van der Not succeeded in seizing power, and the conservative Arndt went into exile, and the rebel army suddenly fell into chaos. The Austrian army took the opportunity to attack and quickly occupied important towns such as Liège and Brussels. The Prussian army once retreated to the Netherlands just when William II was preparing to gather more troops to fight back. France's political ambitions intensified, attracting the attention of Prussia and Austria. Then Louis XVI was beheaded, and the two countries immediately stopped fighting and issued the Pillnitz Declaration to form the first anti-French alliance. The armies of both sides on the southern Netherlands front line gathered together and became a force to intervene in France. It can be said that Louis XVI selflessly used his own brains to eliminate the possible second 7 Years' War. Joseph's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of the chair. Now that he has pressed the French Grand Order, the war situation caused by the Brabant uprising is likely to continue to expand. In this war, how can France maximize its own interests with the least effort? At the top of the conference table, Queen Mary said in a firm tone, "It's good to give my poor brother a break. We have nothing to lose by going to say hello to the Dutch, and we can also gain the gratitude of Austria. That's it. Go ahead, Joseph." Shook his head secretly. At the moment, Austria's main attention was on Prussia, but this did not mean that they had a deep friendship with France. On the contrary, if Austria wants to become the hegemon of Europe, France is the biggest obstacle. They always regard France as their biggest imaginary enemy. Historically, the reason why the anti-French alliance was born so quickly was that revenge for Louis XVI and his wife was just superficial rhetoric. The core factor was Austria, Prussia, and the United Kingdom, who wanted to take advantage of France's fall into chaos and weakness due to the Great Order. At this time, we can solve France's serious problem in one fell swoop. Later, if the emperor had not been born out of nowhere, France in the 19th century would probably have been beaten to pieces by the anti-French coalition forces, and even split into a bunch of small countries. Regardless of the fact that my mother is an Austrian princess, it doesn't mean anything at all. When Austria wants to take action, she won't hesitate at all. Speaking of relatives, the entire European royal family is related to each other, but over the past hundreds of years, whenever there is a dispute over interests, they will immediately get out of their wits. Therefore, there is no need to talk about any feelings between countries. There are only interests. Only by developing France into a country with superior strength can we obtain real security in a European continent full of powerful countries. Joseph quickly recalled the historical trends of Austria, Prussia and other countries in his mind, and gradually outlined the general framework of using the momentum of the Brabant uprising to benefit France. He looked at Queen Mary. "Your Majesty, we should really help Austria." Seeing the Queen's smile, he immediately continued, "But we may also be able to take this opportunity to get the Walloon region. You know, that is a very important place for France. Wallonia is a large region in the southern Netherlands. Almost all people living in it are French-speaking people, who are naturally very close to France. And more importantly, there is one of the largest coal mines in Europe. Coal is the blood of the Industrial Revolution, and it is even more precious for France, which is naturally short of coal. The Saarland region, that is, Alsace and Lorraine, could supply France with its most basic coal needs, but had insufficient reserves to take off in the Industrial Revolution. This is also an important reason why France fought so hard in history and was never able to defeat Britain and Germany in the First Industrial Revolution. It can be said that obtaining coal from Wallonia and iron from Luxembourg will lay the foundation for the French Industrial Revolution to take off. Of course, France's current desire for Wallonia is mainly due to its French-speaking population of more than 1.5 million and the nearby Rhine River. Queen Mary fell silent upon hearing this. She didn't expect that her son would point out France's interests to her so calmly. In comparison, just now I only thought of helping my sick brother. She nodded slightly, agreeing with the Crown Prince's statement. Although she is the sister of Joseph II, she is first and foremost the Queen of France. For her, the interests of France must come first. Chapter 289, The Crown Prince's Diplomacy. Joseph immediately showed a bright smile. "Mother, I want to go to Vienna in person. After my uncle fell ill, I haven't visited him properly. Oh, I will do my best to help my uncle solve Brabant's problem and give him the peace he deserves. In the meantime, my uncle and I still have a lot to talk about." Queen Mary immediately nodded happily. "That's great. My dear, I have always wanted to visit my brother, but France can't live without me. Now it's time for you to go and see Benny for me. Oh, I have to prepare. Give him some gifts." Not long after, the cabinet meeting ended, and Joseph quickly returned to his palace. He first asked Eamon to find Count Seger, the assistant foreign minister, and ordered the latter to write a letter to the US ambassador to Poland in a private capacity. After Count Seger laid out the paper and pen, Joseph said, "The main content of the letter is to warn Prince Poniatowski never to send troops to support Prussia, as that would offend Austria, the only one of Poland's 3 neighboring countries that is more sympathetic to them. At the moment, Poland should take advantage of the conflict between Russia and Sweden and the conflict between Prussia and Austria in the southern Netherlands to solve the problem of the one-vote veto system in the parliament as soon as possible and train as many troops as possible. Due to France's actions in North Africa, the Ottomans surrendered earlier than historically, which gave Russia more energy to deal with Sweden. If nothing else happens, the Russo-Swedish war should end earlier than in history. Then it will be time for Russia to set its sights on Poland. To prevent Prussia and Austria from colluding, we must do our best to prevent the emergence of the Russo-Prussian-Austrian alliance to carve up Poland. Then Poland must first be strong. In order to avoid suspicion among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, Joseph asked the United States to be France's white glove to help Poland, so this letter had to be handed over to the Americans. Count Seger quickly wrote down the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and Joseph said to him, "By the way, when Archbishop Talleyrand returns from England, you will ask him to go to Strasbourg immediately and wait for me there. Vienna. Remember to ask him to bring a few reliable assistants. Strasbourg is the last border city from France to Austria." "Yes, Your Highness." At noon that day, Joseph left France, but not to Austria. He had to wait for Foreign Minister Talleyrand to go there, so that some things would be more convenient. More importantly, both Prussia and Austria had to mobilize troops on a large scale. Logistics alone would take several months to prepare, and the Brabant uprising would not be able to start in a short period of time. His first stop was Spain. After all, his old friend Carlos IV was crowned, and he had to express himself on behalf of France, and he still had a lot to explain to Spain. A big team made. Spain currently has very consistent interests with France, and its national strength is relatively weak. So international events almost follow France's lead, making it a good ally. It's just that this guy owns a large number of colonies and has the third largest naval fleet in Europe, but he has developed into the lowest level of European powers. If Spain can be made stronger, France can borrow more of his power, especially in dealing with Britain. Gibraltar, the gateway to the Mediterranean, is on the southern coast of Spain. It was originally Spanish territory and was ceded to the United Kingdom after the Spanish Succession War more than 70 years ago. Since then, the Spaniards have been obsessed with this strategic location, to the point of being lovesick. Seizing the Strait of Gibraltar from the British will ensure France's interests in North Africa to a great extent, no matter how powerful the British fleet is. It will not be able to reach the Mediterranean without entering the Strait of Gibraltar, and it will not be able to influence the North African countries on the southern coast of the Mediterranean. Joseph left Paris and the carriage headed southwest. It took only about 10 days to reach the Pyrenees on the border of France and Spain. However, after passing the pass of the Pyrenees, especially after arriving at the Spanish city of Leon, the speed of progress immediately slowed down. The road conditions in Spain are simply worse than those in France. Fortunately, Joseph was riding in the latest model of dual carriage, which was very comfortable, but even so, his butt felt like being tortured. After another half month of bumpy rides, Joseph finally vaguely saw the buildings in Madrid in the distance. He was already thinking about taking a boat directly on the way back. Carlos IV gave the French crown prince a very high standard of courtesy. The welcoming guards lined up 5 miles outside Madrid, and the Spanish Minister of State personally guided the convoy to the glorious royal palace of Madrid. Carlos IV pulled his good brother from outside the palace square and walked all the way to the palace. Exquisite carpets were paved along the way, and honor guards stood on both sides. Thousands of Spanish nobles and dignitaries from various countries who came to congratulate gathered in front of the palace and looked at Joseph respectfully. The salutes in the distance almost never stopped. Everyone in Spain knows that the King of France is a very eccentric person, and it is almost impossible to expect him to come to Spain, so the Dauphin of France represents the King of France here. Joseph took the flowers sent by a group of Spanish children and walked into the palace with Carlos V. He noticed that, although the newly crowned Queen of Spain, Maria Luisa, was always by his side, she seemed cautious and made almost no sound during the whole process. Joseph secretly breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the old king had indeed completely emptied the power of this woman. She should not be able to bully Spain like in history. It was worth his trouble to help Carlos IV catch the adulterer after a very sumptuous banquet. Joseph recalled the Spanish meal full of seafood. To be honest, there are many dishes in Spain that are better than French dishes. For example, the main dish just now, Spanish baked seafood stew. It was directly served in a large barrel. The barrel was covered with oysters on the outermost layer, and there was a layer of lobster inside, and then a layer of fish meat, and then a layer of grilled octopus, a layer of sea urchin. The whole barrel was baked with cheese and sprinkled with spices. Just looking at it made people's appetite. Joseph only ate half a barrel, and he was already so full that he couldn't bend down. Here, Carlos IV dragged his good brother into the theater of the palace, and the French playwright's Phèdre was performed. In the VIP room on the second floor, Joseph watched his cousins commenting on the actors' acting skills heartlessly, and couldn't help but sigh secretly. He took advantage of the plot of the Prime Minister in the play and said, "By the way, speaking of the Prime Minister, Your Majesty, your current Minister of State seems to be the Count of Floridablanca." Carlos IV waved his hand. "You should call me Antonio." "Oh, yes, it's still Redondo." Joseph frowned slightly. The Count of Floridablanca was the Minister of State of Carlos III. It seems that without Godoy's messing around, Carlos IV has continued to use the old king's team. However, this Count of Floridablanca doesn't get along well with France. Chapter 290 Britain's Achilles heel. In addition to being the Minister of State in Spain, the Count of Floridablanca also has a very important identity, that is, the executor of Carlos III's reform plan. Point as the last capable king of Spain, Carlos III vigorously promoted enlightened autocratic reforms, allowed the spread of Enlightenment ideas in the country, encouraged the development of industry and commerce, and promoted economic liberalization. At the same time, he also took heavy measures to weaken the power of the church, reduce the privileges of the nobility, and increase the oppression of the colonies, to improve people's livelihood in Spain. It can be said that, if Carlos III can live for a few more decades, Spain may still be able to go uphill. But after his death, Carlos IV could not control the situation at all. The nobles began to oppose the reforms, and Godoy's manipulation of power led to the rapid decline of Spain. Joseph thought for a while, and looked at Carlos IV. Have you heard about the recent events in Brabant? Brabant? Oh, I heard that the citizens there are in rebellion. Then, do you know why the rebellion broke out? It seems that Joseph II wants to weaken the power of the Parliament of the Southern Netherlands. Although Carlos IV was a novice, as a king, he basically knew important international news. Joseph nodded. It's not just the issue of Parliament, but also the reduction of noble privileges. Generally speaking, it is the reforms in Austria that led to the rebellion there. Carlos IV finally looked away from the drama. Dear Joseph, what exactly do you want to say? Don't you think the reforms being carried out in Austria are very similar to those in Spain? Strengthening the authority of the king, weakening the privileges of the nobility, and encouraging the development of industry and commerce. It's very similar. Carlos IV nodded. So, you have to consider that something like Brabant might happen in Spain. Joseph was actually scaring Carlos IV. Spain's reform efforts are not as strong as Austria's, and there are a lot of colonial blood transfusions, so domestic conflicts will not be too acute. In addition, the southern Netherlands is an enclave of Austria. Brussels is more than 800 kilometers away from Vienna, separated by several German states, making it very difficult to rule. Spain does not have these problems. Carlos was very convinced of his good brother and immediately became nervous. It is indeed possible. Recently, there are nobles clamoring to abolish the reform. What should we do? Joseph immediately said, His Majesty Carlos III's reforms must not be suspended. They are the cornerstone of Spain's strength, but the dissatisfaction of the nobles must not be ignored. At this time, we need to give them an outlet to vent their dissatisfaction. You mean, unfortunately, the anger of the nobles will probably be focused on the Secretary of State, Count Floridablanca, who is pushing for reform. Joseph let Carlos IV think for a few seconds before continuing, and sharp conflicts between the nobles and the Minister of State can easily lead to the inability to implement the decree. What do you mean? A different Minister of State? It would be beneficial to Spain to preserve as much as possible the fruits of Carlos III's reforms at the expense of the Count of Floridablanca. The most important thing is that this can ensure the lasting friendship between France and Spain. However, Joseph did not answer. As a Frenchman, he should not say too much about the appointment and dismissal of Spanish officials. It was most appropriate to stop talking. So he changed the topic and talked about the two countries' American colonies. Carlos IV was obviously troubled by colonial issues and soon complained. A lot of money has been invested in New Spain. Note 1. But the returns are getting less and less, and the Creoles' protests take place 11 months of the year, except for the coldest month of winter. The Creoles he mentioned were Europeans whose parents were in the Americas and who were born there themselves. They belonged to the core class of the colonies. Joseph was waiting for his words and immediately said with righteous indignation, the rich products that Spain obtained in the Americas cannot be converted into real profits. This is all because the America-Mediterranean trade was cut by the British. If Gibraltar still belongs to Spain, then American goods will continue to be sold to countries along the Mediterranean Sea, and the annual fiscal revenue can even double. Carlos IV nodded vigorously in agreement, and the Portuguese. They sell Brazilian goods to Europe at low prices, which seriously reduces the profits of American goods. That's right. Joseph nodded more vigorously. The British and Portuguese, they are simply the cancer of Europe, so they've been in alliance since the 14th century, and it's like the devil has always been involved with the curse. As he spoke, the play was over, and the actors came on stage to take their bows. Carlos IV took Joseph and headed to the game room, as if rushing to the scene. There is still some time before the dance, let's go make some bets first. Ah, today's bets are all mine of, Joseph. Followed him to the palace corridor, and saw the servants busy. He whispered in Carlos IV's ear, if you want to take back Gibraltar, I will give you my full support. The latter was suddenly startled. You know, regaining Gibraltar is the long cherished wish of all Spaniards. As Joseph said, this small port can significantly increase Spain's fiscal revenue, and has strategic significance. In controlling the Mediterranean waterways, it can be said that Spain with Gibraltar is almost the same country as Spain without Gibraltar. He looked at Joseph with wide eyes. Are you kidding? Of course not. Joseph patted him on the shoulder. Not just Gibraltar. In the future we will work together to capture Portugal and pull out this poisonous fang in Cadiz Bay. Portugal is an important British naval base and supply point on the European continent, and is also one of the core nodes on the British trade route. This is why the United Kingdom signed the Treaty of Windsor with Portugal hundreds of years ago, to form an alliance point. If Portugal returns to Spain, Britain's influence in Europe will be directly reduced by half, since the British are making trouble and disgusting France everywhere. Joseph will naturally not tolerate him. Coming from a later generation, he knew Britain's weaknesses even better than Britain itself. Carlos IV's eyes widened even more. Although Portugal has been Spain's obsession for more than 100 years, after losing several previous wars, Spain has almost given up on this hard nut to crack point. But now the French crown prince mentioned this tempting prospect. How could he not feel excited? If he can really win Gibraltar and Portugal, he will definitely become the greatest holy lord in Spain for hundreds of years, and will be praised by the Spaniards forever. Note 1. New Spain refers to the Spanish colonies in North America between the late 18th and 19th centuries, mainly today's Mexico and the southwestern United States. In addition, Spain also owns New Granada, which is today's Colombia and Panama. At this time, almost all of South America, with the exception of Brazil, was a Spanish colony. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 291, Spain's Bright Future. Carlos IV stared at Joseph closely and said excitedly, are you just talking casually, or, Joseph said seriously, Her Majesty the Queen asked me to come to Madrid. Carlos suddenly became more excited. His chest heaved violently, and he patted Joseph's shoulders hard. France will always be Spain's closest brother. Joseph also looked forward to the bright future of France and Spain joining hands to control the entire Iberian Peninsula. Hearing this, Carlos IV's blood surged, and he was gearing up. He wished he could raise his army now to drive away the British army in Gibraltar, and then march on Lisbon. Joseph glanced at his expression and said casually, after you get back Gibraltar, Ceuta will be of little use to you. Perhaps France can use it as a supply port. Ceuta is the port on the other side of Gibraltar, and belongs to the southern gate of the Strait of Gibraltar. The port of Ceuta is located in Morocco, and was occupied by Portugal in the 15th century. More than 100 years ago, Spain captured this place from Portugal. Carlos IV nodded in agreement almost without thinking. Of course, there is no problem. Please allow me to present Ceuta to my French brothers on the day I land on Gibraltar. Although, Ceuta's location is also very important, because it is not on the European continent. Supply is very difficult, and its role for the Spanish Navy is quite limited. However, for France, this is not a problem, because North Africa is France's core development direction, and Morocco will inevitably be France's sphere of influence in the future. In other words, France is equivalent to supplying Ceuta from its own territory. Help Spain drive away the British and regain the northern gate of the Strait of Gibraltar. France can also earn a southern gate of the strait for free. This is definitely a very cost-effective deal. Seeing Carlos IV's eagerness to try, Joseph poured cold water on him. Of course, the British still have unshakable maritime power, which makes Portugal difficult to conquer. We must first focus on developing national strength and build a large number of warships after our finances are full. When the navies of our two countries can overwhelm the British, it will be the time to regain Gibraltar. As for the army, we don't need to worry at all. As long as there is no trouble from the British fleet, the French and Spanish coalition forces can capture Portugal within 2 months. At that time, the army that captured the emperor just waved in front of Portugal's house, and the latter surrendered at the speed of light. However, the British Navy was still there at that time, and it was difficult to ensure stable rule by occupying Portugal, so the emperor wanted Portugal's overseas colonies, and ordered the withdrawal. Carlos IV nodded silently, and calmed down. With Spain's current national strength, it simply does not dare to provoke the British. France has just barely escaped from a devastating financial crisis, and may not be able to spare much power to help Spain. Therefore, it is the last word to focus on development now and accumulate battleships. Joseph then talked to him about some suggestions on reform and development. In fact, Carlos III left Spain with a very good team. Gompers, Count of Aranda, are both very capable ministers. Although Count Floridablanca was wary of France, he was also a wise minister. Even Bernardo Tanucci, the chief minister of Carlos III, when he was king of Naples, could be transferred to Spain to assist in government affairs, as long as Spain can keep up with France and stabilize its colonies without causing chaos. Let alone a significant increase in national power, there will be no problem in at least retaining its seat among the European powers. Moreover, the Spanish Navy has always been built quite well. After all, it is a country that has produced an invincible fleet, and its heritage is still there. For a period of time after that, Joseph and Carlos IV talked about the management of the colony, the control of the nobility, and the trade cooperation between France and Spain. Although he did not know how much the latter could understand, he did his best. Well, the rest depends on Spain's national destiny. Of course, there are also daily Spanish meals and various dance parties. 3 days later, Joseph left Madrid under the reluctant farewell of Carlos IV, headed east, boarded a Spanish Navy warship in the port of Valencia, then sailed north, disembarked in the port of Toulon, changed carriages to Austria, go. Strasbourg. Joseph looked at the gift that Talleyrand had brought, which contained several carriages, and couldn't help shaking his head and sighing inwardly. His mother was really an honest person, and the gift she gave to his brother was not stingy at all. Forget it. It's her private money anyway. She can spend it however she likes. He motioned the foreign minister to get in the car, first praised him for his successful trip to England in exchange for Jean, and then explained in detail the diplomatic mission to Vienna. This will be related to France's policy direction for a long time to come. Poland. Warsaw. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Jones, the US ambassador to Poland, looked at the two people in front of him. If the French intelligence agency had not repeatedly assured him that they were correct, it would be difficult for him to believe that they were the so-called people who can change the direction of Poland. The taller man was wearing a coarse cloth jacket and grey-black trousers. The skin on his hands and face was very rough, like a fisherman who went fishing all year round. The other one was fatter and had a bald priest's head. His grey priest's robe was in tatters and he looked like he came from a remote country church. The two of them saluted Jones by stroking their chests and saying hello in French. Regardless of their etiquette or conversation, they all seemed extremely well educated, completely inconsistent with their appearance. Jones returned the gift politely and carefully came to the window to confirm that no one was watching. Then he turned around and took out 2 pamphlets from his pocket, handed them to the two of them, and warned, "Please keep them properly. Due to the need for confidentiality, we did not leave any pamphlets." Baseboard. The fisherman took the pamphlets very carefully and saw that the title of the top one was The Glorious Polish Nation. His heart moved, and he looked at the next book, which was Although I Speak Russian, I Will Always Be a Pole. He quickly flipped through the booklet, and his expression suddenly became excited. He looked at Jones and said, "Okay, this is great. Which great thinker wrote this? We just need it." Jones shrugged and said vaguely, "It is said to be a German. In fact, this was what Joseph asked Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the German National Enlightenment master, to do more than 3 years ago. Although Fichte did not study Poland very deeply, unifying national consciousness mainly relied on incitement and he's the best at this. In addition, the client was very willing to spend money, so he devoted great enthusiasm to work, and completed these 2 works that elaborated on the concept of Polish nation in the shortest possible time. Please print it as soon as possible, and distribute it throughout Poland. Jones warned. Don't worry about funding. The sponsor will contact you soon. Joseph was forced by the grinding efficiency of the Polish parliament to have no choice but to resort to the big killer weapon of national consciousness. Chapter 292 Candidates for President of the United States. Seeing the 2 men taking the pamphlets and preparing to leave, US Ambassador Jones suddenly remembered the instructions in the French Dauphin's letter and hurriedly stopped them again. He solemnly said, "I believe you already have an understanding of the current situation. Keep Poland. Dealing with the Russian ambitions is the top priority, so I hope you can support the king. After all, he can call on more Polish people to resist Russia. Oh, also, you have to put aside your religious demands for the time being. I don't mean to stop you from spreading Catholicism, but that should be done after the crisis in Poland is resolved. If the Bal Alliance can make outstanding contributions in resisting the Russian invasion, I believe that the Polish people will also like Catholicism more." When the 2 people heard the word Bal Alliance, they subconsciously shrank their heads and looked around, looking extremely nervous. Yes, they are the few remaining members of the Bal Alliance in Poland. 7 years ago, some patriotic Polish nobles established the Bar League in order to safeguard the country's political and diplomatic independence and oppose Russia's penetration of Poland. At first, the alliance formed an army to expel Russian forces across Poland and took advantage of the Krivtsina uprising to expand into Lithuania, Ukraine. Note 1. In addition, the alliance actively encouraged the Ottomans to go to war with Russia, which to a certain extent contributed to the Fifth Russo-Turkish War. However, as the alliance grew, the policies implemented shifted. The first was to declare his opposition to the King of Poland. After all, Stanislaus II was the former lover of Catherine II, and he was able to be elected King of Poland. Note 2. There was also the factor behind the Russian Tsar bribing the Polish parliament. Therefore, the Bal Alliance was very resistant to this king, announced that it would oppose him, and even briefly kidnapped Stanislaus. Then the League fell into religious fanaticism and began to crazily promote Catholicism in Poland and persecute Protestants and Orthodox Christians. So Catherine II united Prussia and Austria and launched an invasion of Poland on the pretext of protecting the Polish king and the Orthodox Christians. The Bal Alliance was defeated before the Russian army could hold out for long, but the Russian, Prussian and Austro-Austrian armies did not stop, but occupied their respective Polish territories. This was the beginning and end of the first partition of Poland. After the war, most of the leaders of the Bal Alliance and their families were imprisoned in concentration camps built in Lithuania, and a small number were exiled to Siberia. Although the Bal Alliance failed, Joseph knew that they were the most determined anti-Russian group in Poland. And as long as they did not engage in religious fanaticism, they also had a high level of support among ordinary people and the military. It would be most appropriate for them to promote Polish national consciousness. As long as it can generate national consciousness, it can greatly enhance Poland's internal cohesion, and at the same time, reduce the living space for pro-Russian Polish traitors. You must know that Russia, Prussia, and Austria were able to easily divide Poland, largely because Poland is divided into Polish, Lithuanian, Slavic, and German ethnic groups. They do not understand each other's language, and have independent policies. They will undermine each other when encountering invasion by foreign enemies. With Poland's population and land area, if it can really be twisted into a rope, it will be difficult for Russia, and Austria to take it down in a short time. Moreover, if the situation in Poland becomes irreversible in the future, we can also use the influence of the Bal Alliance to mobilize resistance among the Polish people and fight guerrilla warfare against Russia, Prussia, and Austria for several years. The next day. In Dome Palace. This is the residence of Prince Poniatowski, nephew of the King of Poland. At this time, Jones was strolling in the garden behind the house with several Polish nobles, just like an ordinary afternoon chat. Actually, what the major families are worried about is that the power of parliament will be limited if the free veto is abolished. An aristocratic old man in his 60s looked at the US ambassador to Poland, so it is best to pass the three powers first. A separate constitution would also solve the problem of the free veto. The free veto he was talking about was Poland's notorious one-vote veto system. Any member of the parliament can veto parliamentary decrees with one vote, making it impossible for Poland to carry out reform and progress. Yes, I'm very familiar with this kind of political wrangling. Jones nodded and said in Polish, the US Congress often does this too, and it is really a headache. At this time, what we need is a leader with extremely high political authority to unify different opinions. Prince Poniatowski sighed helplessly. His Majesty the King. You know, he is always so easy to talk to. Jones turned to look at him. Perhaps you can call on those congressmen on behalf of your Majesty. The old man on the side immediately shook his head. The Potocki family will not listen to His Royal Highness. Oh, and the arrogant Czartoryski family. He is the elder of the Poniatowski family. You can tell by looking at the last name that this is the family of the King of Poland, but it is far from the largest family in Poland. At present, Polish politics is basically controlled by less than 10 aristocratic families. If you want to pass anything in parliament, you cannot get around them. Jones recalled the letter from the French crown prince and said solemnly, Poland has reached a very dangerous edge. At this time, perhaps it should use some less gentlemanly methods. His Royal Highness is currently responsible for the recruitment and training of the army. You must take advantage of this. As for the Potocki family, maybe they have done some despicable things. If this is known to other families, they will be very happy to divide their power. Several senior members of the Poniatowski family immediately looked at each other in surprise. The old man lowered his voice and said, I'm afraid this will cause a big mess, so His Royal Highness needs to mobilize the army in a timely manner to stabilize the situation. As long as the Potocki family is solved, the Czartoryski family will definitely start to become cooperative. Prince Poniatowski frowned. Maybe there is no need to make such a big move. The conditions proposed by the Potocki family are actually negotiable. Jones sighed in his heart. As the mouthpiece of the French crown prince, he could only do so much. The decision lies with you, Your Majesty the Prince, but I can guarantee that the Potocki family will be eliminated within 3 months. The evidence of treason is given to you. He had no evidence of the Potocki family's crimes, but the French told him there would be. Joseph knew very well that historically, although the Poles were very procrastinating, they finally passed a constitution 3 years later, the May 3rd Constitution. This constitution abolished the one-vote veto system, abolished the king's election system, changed it to hereditary, established the Polish political system of separation of powers, and paved the way for national development. However, the May 3rd Constitution's restrictions on the power of the nobility touched the interests of some families headed by the Potocki family. They immediately colluded with the Russian Prince Potemkin to form the Tugavika alliance, and requested Russia to send troops to intervene. Subsequently, the troops of the Tugavika Union and the Russian army defeated the Polish government forces. At the same time, Prussia and Austria invaded Poland from the west in accordance with the secret agreement with Russia. The second partition of Poland begins. The Potocki family has always been in cahoots with the Russians, and if you look for it, you will definitely find evidence. Of course, Joseph was also prepared to create some evidence if he really couldn't find any evidence. As long as the Potocki family is brought down, someone will naturally confess. And now that the Russo-Swedish war is in full swing, Russia cannot spare a hand to intervene in this matter. As long as the May 3rd Constitution can be implemented smoothly for a few years, Poland's national strength will be greatly enhanced. Moreover, without the Potocki family's internal support, Russia's excuse to send troops will disappear, and it will become very difficult to carve up Poland. If Prussia and Austria, especially the latter, believe that invading Poland will seriously deplete their own strength, then they will probably have to weigh whether they should join the war, because both Prussia and Austria have the desire to unify Germany, as long as there is no common interest in dividing Poland, they will definitely start a war for hegemony in Germany. In that case, the strategic pressure faced by France will be greatly reduced. At least it can buy France a few more years of development time. Prince Poniatowski hesitated for a while. then bowed to Jones and said, "Thank you for your help to Poland, Ambassador. I will definitely consider your suggestion seriously. Oh, the party is about to start. Let's go inside." USA Point, New York. The votes are counted. A middle-aged man wearing a short black vest opened the door and entered the room with excitement. Under the anxious and expectant gazes of the people in the room, he deliberately paused for 2 seconds before asking George Washington stroked his chest and saluted. "Congratulations, Your Excellency, President." More than a dozen people in the room immediately burst into cheers and gathered around Washington to congratulate him. Washington's red face became even redder in an instant, but he took a deep breath and looked at the messenger. "Mr. Thomas, can you tell me the specific votes?" "You got 50 votes, an overwhelming advantage." Washington suddenly felt relieved. 50 votes out of all 69 votes was definitely considered a big victory. At the same time, he was secretly thankful that the French Dauphin had helped him. Otherwise, given Hamilton's astonishing popularity before the election, he would have been the one celebrating his election at this time. Even with the support of the French, Hamilton still got 33 votes. Note 3. Joseph brought Hamilton the achievements of eradicating pirates in the Mediterranean and sending pirates back to the United States for public trial, which made the latter unparalleled in the limelight, even surpassing Washington, the commander of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. There is no way. People are forgetful, and the War of Independence has been over for several years, so how can I remember the hanging of pirates? A few months ago, however, Joseph soon realized that Hamilton was a very radical hawk and had a special obsession with the army. If he is elected as the President of the United States, he is likely to re-establish a standing army. Currently the United States only has militias and no professional soldiers, and this will greatly speed up the United States' westward slaughter of Indians and devouring North American land. A United States with only 13 states is nothing to worry about, but a United States occupying half of the Americas will become a nightmare for all of Europe. Of course Joseph wanted to prevent this from happening. So he sent people to the United States to support Washington, whose overall style was relatively moderate. At least while he was in power, the United States relied on militias to get by. His method is very simple. He provides some campaign funds to Washington and at the same time creates a newspaper, American News, in the United States and sells it at a very low price. With cheap wood, paper and printing technology from France, the newspaper is 60 yuan cheaper than its American counterparts. Percent can still make 10% profit. Coupled with the exclusive US publishing rights of Refining the Sky, American News unified the US newspaper market in a very short period of time. What followed was a daily publication of the Revolutionary War in newspapers, constantly mentioning Washington's great contributions, and at the same time crediting the federal Congress with the credit for combating the Barbary pirates. Those lawmakers therefore praised US News for its objectivity and impartiality. Under the arrangement of the French campaign team, Washington gave speeches and performed various shows across the United States, and his public support rate quickly surpassed Hamilton's. Of course, Washington reciprocated the favor. Jones, the ambassador sent to Poland, was his confidant, and he was dedicated to his work. While Washington was celebrating the election of the president, a meeting was being held in the manager's office of the American News newspaper to discuss opening a branch. According to the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, a more orthodox newspaper such as the News of the United States is not enough to cover all Americans. A newspaper focusing on entertainment content must be opened to attract people at the bottom of the United States. In the subsequent US congressional elections, newspapers will have to recommend at least 10 congressmen, which is an arduous task. Driving in Baden's carriage, Talleyrand looked at the Crown Prince opposite and smiled, and asked tentatively, "Your Highness, have you seen any good news?" Joseph pushed the report sent from Nancy to him before leaving the French border. "Look, this is the sales of the United Steam Engine Company last month. Our high-pressure steam engines have been sold to the UK, and orders are still coming in." The Foreign Secretary obviously didn't understand the significance of the steam engine, so he smiled and said, "Oh, one can be sold for 11,000 livres. It's really a good business." "Yeah, I'm afraid it's the best business Joseph smiled and nodded. You know, the low pressure steam engine produced by what company costs £480, which is 12,000 livres, but its power is only 60% of the French product point. If most of the United Steam Engine Company's production capacity were not supplied to France, what company might not be able to continue operating? Note 1. At the end of the 18th century, Ukraine was still a geographical term, and a large part of it belonged to Lithuania. Note 1. Poland implemented a king election system at the end of the 18th century, and a parliament composed of nobles elected the king. This gave foreign countries an excellent way to interfere in Poland's internal affairs. As long as they bribed Polish parliamentarians, they could elect their favorite king. This was how Catherine II sent her lover Stanislaus II to the throne. Note 2. During the first presidential election in the United States, each presidential elector could vote for more than one candidate. Chapter 293 Big Thunder in Vienna. Talleyrand did not know the importance of the steam engine, but Joseph knew it better than anyone. The steam engine is the soul of the first industrial revolution. Whoever masters the most advanced steam engine technology will have the key to the future, and what, the soul of the British Industrial Revolution, will no longer be the chosen son in history. Unlike later countries that invested heavily in technological competition, European countries in the 18th century were far from realizing the huge impact of these mechanical gadgets on national strength. So the British government had no intention of subsidizing the Watt Company. In addition, the Treaty of Eden signed by Britain and France stipulated that France enjoyed negligible tariffs on industrial products sold by Britain. A year and a half ago, the British firmly believed that France could not have any decent industry. Products can be exported to Britain, so even if the British government wants to protect its own steam engine industry, it will be unable to do so under the restrictions of the treaty. The French United Steam Engine Company has begun to set up a branch in Birmingham. On the one hand, it can easily repair the machines sold to the UK. On the other hand, it can also absorb British talents in this field. When it encounters good talents, it will go to France for business trips. They are trying to drain the UK from under the cauldron. The funds used by the British to purchase steam engines can continue to be used to promote the technological research and development of the United Steam Engine Company. It can be said that France has taken the lead in this regard, and will take the lead step by step in the future. Joseph had already written to the United Steam Engine Company to increase investment and increase production in order to occupy the British steam engine market as soon as possible. Seeing that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince seemed to attach great importance to the export of steam engines, Talleyrand immediately followed the topic and said, "Your Highness, since this machine can be sold well in the UK, maybe we can also promote it in Austria and Bavaria." Joseph gave him an appreciative look. "You are right, Archbishop Talleyrand. In fact, my main mission in going to Austria this time is to sign the Austria-France trade agreement with my uncle. Oh, it would be best if under the influence of Austria, other German states can take the initiative to sign a trade agreement with France. If it doesn't go so smoothly, I will at least sign the agreement with Saxony and Bavaria before returning to France. Oh, regarding diplomatic matters, I have to leave the hard work to you and your subordinates. French industrial products need a broad market to have sufficient sales. This time he went to find a market for French goods. The wealthy core areas of Europe are naturally the best markets right now. The markets of Austria, Saxony, and Bavaria account for more than 60% of the German region. If possible, Joseph even wants to sign a trade agreement with Prussia. As for small countries such as Poland, Denmark, and Italy, it is left to the Secretary of Commerce to sign agreements with them. Bilateral trade agreements are still relatively new in Europe. The most representative one currently is the Treaty of Eden between Britain and France. Other European countries are also interested in trying, but they are not clear about the methods, so it is a good time for Joseph to take advantage of this information gap. Of course, French products have not yet begun to be sold in Europe, which is one of the important reasons why the agreement can be signed. Otherwise, smart European countries will not easily let French goods in for dumping. Along the way, Joseph was preoccupied with French industry and trade, but ignored that a big thunder was waiting for him in Vienna. 10 days later, along the main road southwest of Vienna, the flag of the Austrian Forbidden Army stretched for several miles. At the front of the group was the future HRE Emperor Leopold II. However, because Emperor Shinra was elected by the electors, his current official identity is still the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He came to greet the Dauphin of France on behalf of the seriously ill Joseph II. Austria was about to use troops in the southern Netherlands, and Prussia was likely to intervene in the war, so he wanted to use the opportunity of the French Dauphin's visit to gain France's support for Austria. Next to him, the lady wearing the latest light purple dress from Paris Fashion Week and a wide-brimmed hat decorated with colorful feathers is the current Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Maria Vidaluxi. Note 1. Leopold II saw the French motorcade approaching from a distance and immediately signaled to the entourage behind him. A group of ceremonial officers immediately raised the flag, and at the same time the band began to play cheerful music. The carriage stopped. Emin jumped out first, then bowed and opened the door on the other side. Leopold II, surrounded by a large number of Austrian officials, greeted Joseph. "Ah, dear Joseph. I have been waiting for you for a long time. Look, the whole of Vienna is welcoming you." As soon as he came up, he greeted Joseph as a relative, and the meaning was quite intriguing. Joseph got out of the car, walked a few steps quickly, and saluted Leopold II. "Dear uncle, I'm glad that you came to pick me up and made me feel like I was back in Paris. Oh, and mother, she let me tell you that she misses you very much." After a few brief greetings, Joseph politely bent down and took Maria Vidaluca's hand, kissing the back of her hand gently. This is an etiquette to show respect to a lady of high status. "Dear aunt, you are like the spring rain and dew in Vienna, spreading endless kindness and care to everyone. You are the most dazzling morning light in Austria, illuminating the entire kingdom with nobility and grace." Maria Vidaluca returned the favor with a smile, and at the same time, looked at the handsome French crown prince. Coupled with the compliment just now, her heart was already filled with joy. No wonder Clementine was full of praise for her cousin after she came back, and her reputation was well deserved. "I'm afraid she couldn't find a better son-in-law than him in the whole of Europe." She glanced at the carriages filled with gifts in the distance and thought to herself, this should be the betrothal gift. Right? Oh, no, the bride price should not be brought by the fiancé in person. It should be just a meeting gift. The meeting gift is so generous. When the Queen of France actually pays the betrothal gift, it will probably have to fill more than a dozen carriages. "Oh, you must be tired from the journey, right?" Victor Luca happily hugged his future son-in-law and gestured towards the city of Vienna. "His Majesty the Emperor has prepared a grand banquet and is waiting for you at Schönbrunn Palace." She lowered her voice again and said with some regret, "Clementine didn't know you were coming and returned to Tuscany half a month ago. If you can stay in Vienna for a while, I can send someone to urge her to come back." Note 1. Leopold II's wife was Spanish Princess Maria Luisa, because she has the same name as the wife of Carlos IV, the one who put the hat on him. Her German name Maria Vidaluca is used for the convenience of narration in the article. Chapter 294 Austria's interests. "Oh, you'd better let her be busy. Tuscany is so far away, it's not easy to go back and forth." Joseph smiled and declined. He came to Austria to do business, and he didn't want to be pestered by little Lalita all day long. Vidaluca was startled for a moment, then smiled again. The French crown prince was worried that Clementine would suffer from the turbulence when she rushed back. "It turns out that my son-in-law is not only handsome, but also very considerate. I'm getting more and more satisfied." Led by Leopold II and his wife, Joseph drove all the way through the streets of Vienna towards Schönbrunn Palace. Vienna was very different from what he remembered. There was no peaceful and artistic atmosphere, and everything was shabby. Although he met a few street musicians on the road, most of the music they produced was quite harsh. The fesses and urine on the streets are comparable to those in Paris before the renovation of public toilets. At the same time, there are also sceneries like garbage mountains. At many street intersections, half of the road is blocked by garbage. What made Joseph feel most awkward was the feigned hostility in the eyes of passers-by when they looked at the French crown prince driving his car. But this is not surprising. France and Austria have been fighting back and forth for hundreds of years for hegemony in Europe, and their people have also hated each other for hundreds of years after finally arriving at Schönbrunn Palace. The nobles who greeted him in front of the palace showed basic enthusiasm and etiquette point regardless of his illness. Joseph II personally came to the gate of Schönbrunn Palace with the support of his servants to greet his nephew. Joseph hurriedly stepped forward to salute his uncle, then pushed away the servant, picked up his arm himself, and said enthusiastically, "Dear Your Majesty the Emperor, my father always said that, if he hadn't been busy with state affairs, and couldn't get away, he would have come long ago. It's up to you. Oh, mother misses you very much too, and asked me to bring you many gifts, which are in the carriage behind." Luca's eyes twitched when he heard this from behind. Isn't that car a gift for me? Joseph didn't know what she was thinking, and continued to say to Joseph II, "Mother heard that there was a rebellion in the southern Netherlands, and she was worried that you were working too hard, so I must help you share your worries." Joseph II nodded happily, and wanted to say something, but he coughed violently. He just raised his hand to gesture in the direction of the banquet hall. Following closely behind them, Count Cornitz, the Austrian Minister of State, vaguely heard Joseph's words. He quickly turned to look at the French foreign minister aside, and whispered in pure French, "Archbishop Talleyrand, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince means, will France send troops to the southern Netherlands to support Austria?" He is considered the most pro-French among Austrian senior officials. He spends several months of vacation in France every year, and even the most expensive clothes are sent to Paris for starching to show his authentic Parisian style. Therefore, he is also the most hopeful that France can participate in the counter-insurgency in the southern Netherlands. Talleyrand immediately showed a very sincere smile. "Her Majesty the Queen does intend to send troops. But you also know that France is in a terrible financial situation and cannot even spend millions to mobilize troops. In terms of funding, Vienna can provide." Cornitz had just finished speaking when he was interrupted by Talleyrand with a smile. "So the Duke of Broglie proposed that France could provide logistical support to the Austrian army to transfer supplies from Vienna to Brabant. We have to travel nearly 1,000 kilometers along the way. Oh, that's more than 120 miles, and the transportation consumption will be huge, and we can resupply from Verdun, which will be much easier." Cornitz's eyes immediately lit up. If a war breaks out in the southern Netherlands, Prussia's biggest advantage over Austria is a closer supply distance point, and if Austria gets logistical support from France, then Prussia's advantage will turn into a disadvantage. France and the southern Netherlands are directly bordering. In this way, even if France does not directly send troops, it will still provide great support to the Austrian army. He immediately bowed slightly to Talleyrand. "Thank you, Her Majesty the Queen, for making the decision that is most beneficial to Ford." Talleyrand showed an embarrassed look. "Look, France's poor finances. I'm just worried that when the war in the southern Netherlands is reaching a stalemate, there will be problems with the funds to purchase military supplies. Those black-hearted businessmen don't even think about it. I would like to give the royal family a penny on credit." Cornitz hurriedly said, "How can we ask Her Majesty the Queen to pay for it? All supplies will be paid for by Vienna according to the purchase price." In this way, France earned a huge favor from Austria without sending a single soldier. As for the purchase price, France doesn't have the final say. It's always much cheaper than shipping it from Austria. Entering the banquet hall, Cornitz took Talleyrand to sit next to him and began to discuss logistical supply arrangements for the southern Netherlands. As he spoke, he let out a long sigh. "Even with the help of France, this expedition will probably strain the empire's finances for a while." Talleyrand nodded in agreement. In fact, the overseas trade income of the southern Netherlands is getting lower and lower, and it is almost of no value to His Majesty the Emperor. "Oh, by the way, if Archduke Otto of Bavaria is interested in the southern Netherlands, maybe we can take advantage of this rebellion to make some territorial exchanges with him." Cornitz looked at him with some surprise. This is indeed a strategic goal that Austria very much wants to achieve. Compared to the far-flung enclave of the southern Netherlands, Bavaria, which borders Austria and is very wealthy, is what Austria wants most. Territory. It's just He frowned and shook his head. I'm afraid Grand Duke Ottodal won't agree. Right, I can help you convince Archduke Ottodal about this, Talleyrand said immediately. Joseph told him on the way here that Archduke Ottodal had always had a dream of reviving the Burgundy dynasty, not the current Burgundy region of France, but the powerful Burgundy of the Middle Ages, which owned the entire south, a vast territory stretching from the Netherlands to Mannheim. Therefore, Ottodal has always wanted to get the southern Netherlands, so that he could get rid of the restrictions of the Holy Roman Elector territory and hand over the southern Netherlands land that did not belong to the Elector to his illegitimate son. Yes, he had no legitimate children, only a lot of illegitimate children. This resulted in his Bavaria being passed down only to relatives in Saxony. To him, the southern Netherlands was more valuable than rich Bavaria. Cornets grabbed Talleyrand excitedly. Are you really sure? Yes, I'm somewhat confident in my eloquence. Talleyrand smiled and nodded. And if Austria can reach an exchange agreement with Bavaria, then the rebellion in the southern Netherlands will be Bavaria's own business. Archduke Ottodal more troops will definitely be committed to deal with the rebellion. After this, Austria and Bavaria, with their common interests, can do more. He pointed to the north, for example, deal with Saxony, or even march to Silesia. Chapter 295 Franco-Austrian Trade Agreement. Cornets' pupils shrank when he heard the word Silesia. Silesia is definitely a pain in the heart of every Austrian. It was after this rich handicraft area was occupied by the Prussians that Austria completely lost its identity as the communist master of Germany. At the same time, Prussia was looked upon with admiration by European countries and officially joined the ranks of the first-class powers, becoming a strong contender for Germany's communist master. If any Austrian said that he did not want to regain Silesia, he would be immediately thrown into prison as a traitor. Cornets, however, kept his cool. Silesia must return to Austria, but not now. Although the radical reforms initiated by His Majesty the Emperor will make Austria stronger in the future, for now it has only brought chaos and weakness to the country. He still remembered that during the last Bavarian succession war, Austria mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops and tried to take advantage of the chaos to recapture Silesia. But they did not even touch the edge of Silesia and were blocked by the Prussian army in Saxony. Saxony is the western gateway to Silesia. The Austrian army and the Prussians were in a stalemate for more than a year, consuming a huge amount of logistical supplies, but failing to make any progress on the battlefield. In the end, they had to armistice with the mediation of France and Russia. As a result, Austria had to vomit out the Lower Bavarian that had been eaten in its mouth. You know, that war happened 10 years ago. At that time, Austria's reforms had not yet started, and its national power was stronger than it is now. It was unable to conquer Prussia. It is even more impossible to recapture Silesia now. Cornets breathed out, smiled and shook his head. There is no need for Austria to go to war with Prussia yet. To be honest, General Wilms's army is ready to go, and the rebellion in Brabant will be quelled soon. By then Prussia people can only withdraw to Potsdam. If you can convince Bavaria to send more troops, the process will be faster. Talleyrand then smiled and raised his glass to signal him to General Wilmser and his glorious victory. But in his heart, he silently recalled His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's firm judgment that the Austrian army would suffer a disastrous defeat in the southern Netherlands. He will stay in Vienna during this period, waiting for the news of the Austrian army's failure to come back, and then start the next step. According to His Highness, Austria will not be willing to fail, and will mobilize the country's troops for a decisive battle with Prussia. His mission is to lead the decisive battle from the southern Netherlands to Silesia. At the main seat in the banquet hall, Joseph II did not touch the food in front of him at all. He could only eat porridge and stewed fish this year, but looked at his French nephew with interest. You mean, if this trade agreement is signed, France will impose tariffs of less than 5% on all Austrian exports of glass, fur products, silverware, and musical instruments. With his recent physical condition, he can rarely speak such a long paragraph in one breath. Joseph smiled and nodded. You forgot the linen, Your Majesty. Oh, textiles. Joseph II waved his hand and said with a smile, I'm not sick yet. Austrian textiles are far inferior to French products and cannot be sold in France at all. Joseph thought seriously, then raised his head and said, "Mother asked me to help you as much as possible, and linen is an extremely important commodity in Austria. Well, France can reduce the tariff on this area to zero, including all over North Africa and the Caribbean, and Austria can impose any tariff on French linen." A look of surprise that he hadn't seen for a long time flashed through Joseph II's muddy eyes. "Oh, my dear sister, she is always so generous." According to the Franco-Austria trade agreement proposed by Joseph just now, Austria's most important commodities such as glass and fur can enter France at very low tariffs in the future. In addition, goods such as minerals, grain, cotton, and wood will be able to enter France at very low tariffs. France can enjoy the benefit of being exempted from paying tolls. This is a benefit that even France's own goods do not have. Currently, when goods are shipped from Lyon to Paris, they have to pay tolls at least 10 times in the middle point. If this agreement can be implemented, Austria's commodity exports will usher in historic glory. Judging from his experience, it can increase export revenue by at least 30% to 40%, thus bringing in large amounts of fiscal revenue. This will play a huge supporting role in his difficult reforms. However, as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II knew that there was no free lunch in the world, and this huge benefit would definitely require Austria to pay a corresponding price point. So he waved a silver fork in his hand to Joseph. "Perhaps I should give something back to my dear sister, so that I can feel at ease." Joseph smiled. "You are my closest uncle, so you don't have to be so polite. But if Austria can also reduce some tariffs on French goods, I believe my mother will be very happy." Joseph II immediately put on a posture of listening carefully. "Tell me more specifically." "Well, you know, there are a large number of workers in Lyon who depend on textiles for their livelihood, and it would be great if France could get a lower tariff on this than England. Except, of course, on linens." Joseph glanced at Emperor Shinra and added, "It is best to be more than 5% cheaper than British products." Although France's textile industry was no match for Britain's, it still had an unparalleled advantage over other European countries. Joseph estimated that with the extensive use of automatic looms and steam engines, as well as the wool supplied by New Zealand, it would take another year to 1.5 years for the cost of the French textile industry to be close to that of the United Kingdom. By then, as long as the tariffs are more favorable than those of Britain, France will be able to significantly occupy the Austrian textile market. Joseph II pondered for a moment, but did not agree. "I'm afraid this is a bit difficult. Britain has the most favored nation status for Austrian textiles. The most I can do is make France and Britain have the same textile tariffs." Joseph could accept this. After all, a 5% discount was just an exorbitant asking price. So if you want to gain an advantage in terms of cost, you can only find ways in transportation and the like. He put on a depressed expression. "How can French textiles compete with British?" "Okay, then you have to give me low tariffs on machinery, steel products, paper, chemicals, etc." Joseph II thought quickly. Except for paper, among these commodities, he had not heard of how competitive French products were. Anyway, the cost of French paper is so low that it makes the whole of Europe tremble, and it is impossible to stop it. So agreeing to reduce tariffs on these things seems to have no impact. Chapter 296 The Most Outstanding Son-in-Law. The most important thing is that the nephew just did not mention France's largest export commodity, wine. In comparison, glass, fur products, etc. are Austria's pillar industries. He chuckled in his heart. The young nephew still lacked experience. Although adding a large number of goods with reduced tariffs to France and the trade agreement would make the agreement look better, the total of them was far less than the export volume of a single wine. So he nodded very generously. "Then, the tariff on paper is set to 15%, and the other 5%. What do you think?" Joseph immediately sat on the ground and paid back the money. "Look, I have lowered Austria's linen tariffs to zero. You can at least lower the tariffs on steel products or chemicals a little more." Emperor Shinra smiled, picked up the wine glass, and took a sip. "Well, since my dear nephew has said so, let's reduce the tariff on chemical products to zero. Austria still has some steel industry, and even sells a large amount of it to German states. As for chemicals, To be honest, he didn't know exactly what he was referring to. It was probably something like sulfuric acid. The annual trade volume might not even be 10,000 florins. Joseph put on the innocent smile that a young man should have, and bowed to his uncle. You are such an easygoing elder. Now our trade agreement looks much fairer. Immediately, he continued to climb along the pole. Dear uncle, for the convenience of Phao's trade, maybe we can also add a clause in the agreement that transport ships can freely enter each other's inland waterways. Oh, of course, it is still allowed to carry out the necessary boarding inspection before crossing the border. Joseph II's physical strength was almost exhausted, and he waved his hands weakly. I will seriously consider this. Joseph hurriedly seized the last opportunity and spoke quickly. Do you think it is possible to extend the mutually beneficial trade agreement between France and Austria to the entire Germany, at Bavaria, Salzburg, Württemberg, Baden and other countries, and sign a trade agreement together? Even Saxony, Thuringia, and Hesse can join this trade agreement in the future. Joseph II shook his head tiredly. They are all worried that Phao's goods will flood their market, and I'm afraid they are not willing to join this kind of agreement to liberalize tariffs. Even relatively large German states such as Bavaria and Saxony cannot resist Austrian products, let alone other small countries. In this era when market economic theory is still extremely immature, the tariffs set by everyone are higher than the others. A sly smile flashed in Joseph's eyes. Then we will give the profit to them. Emperor Shenlo gathered his strength for a few seconds and then said, but why do you do this? Joseph thought that of course it was to use Austria's influence in the German states, which was much easier than France talking to them one by one. But what he said to his uncle was, this will allow them to reduce their trade with Prussia, and the reduction in trade means less contact. This has a positive significance for establishing Austria's prestige in Germany. In fact, as long as the negotiation strategy is appropriate, Austria will not suffer any losses. After all, Austria's size is here. Even if the terms of the agreement are not so favorable, as the country continues to develop, Austria will eventually be able to benefit from a larger market. Benefit. Joseph II, who was already extremely tired, suddenly had a bright look in his eyes. When he heard this, he was a smart man and immediately figured out what his nephew meant. For example, small countries like Thuringia and Württemberg, even if they are relatively strong in a certain industry, how strong can they be? Even if they are technologically advanced, because the country is small, their export volume will not be too large. And for Austria, it is generally not difficult to find other countries to replace the advantageous industries of small countries. But once a big country like Austria takes the lead in any industry, small countries will basically have to accept the fate of being dumped. Therefore, regardless of short-term interests, tie small countries to your side first, use them to expand your market, and make them dependent on Austrian goods and markets. This is the most important thing. Perhaps the desire to unify Germany, which could not be achieved through war, can be achieved using this method. The look in his eyes, when he looked at his nephew, was full of shock. This was probably not a strategy that his sister would have thought of. He knew her very well. Was it the idea of this young godson or a capable minister in France? In fact, this was just Joseph's practice of the economic colonial concept of later generations. Among the big countries in later generations, which one did not circle the small countries around them to form a unified market. What the emperor of the Shinra did not realize was that he thought that Austria was taking the lead, tying the German states to himself, and that France was getting some soup from it. But in Joseph's eyes, Austria is no different from Thuringia and Württemberg. They all have the label of France's industrial products market on their foreheads. Joseph II finally couldn't hold it any longer and signaled his brother Leopold II to continue discussing the trade agreement with his nephew. With the help of his servants, he returned to the bedroom to rest. By the end of the banquet, Leopold II had discussed the details of the trade agreement with Joseph. He was much more energetic than his brother, so he thought much more carefully, taking precautions in advance for all foreseeable industries that France could have an impact on Austria. But what he didn't expect was that France's industrial development speed would soon turn almost all valuable industries into its own strengths. After Leopold II and Joseph were cheered by the nobles, they left the banquet hall and walked towards the concert hall. Maria Vidaluca gave the nobleman on Joseph's left a subtle wink, took 2 quick steps, and arrived at the latter's position just now. She was about the same height as Joseph. She turned her head and said, "My dear, the way His Majesty the Emperor looked at you just now was really full of appreciation and satisfaction. Well, he has never shown so much affection for Clementine before." Joseph was stunned for a moment and said hurriedly, "My cousin is the kindest and most lovely lady. I heard that your Majesty's favorite junior is her." Vidaluca covered his mouth with a fan and laughed. "Clementine's shortcoming is that she is very jealous sometimes and cares about the people she likes." She suddenly lowered her voice. "So, if you don't have another mistress in the future, oh, just like your father, I think she will be very happy." Joseph was stunned again. He didn't expect that the topic would turn to this. He immediately started to sweat a little and hurriedly looked around and said, "Well, which one? I heard that Mr. Mozart will come to perform later." Chapter 297 General Wilms's bitter battle. "Yes, he should be in the Hall of Mirrors now. It seems that you also like this talented musician very much, Victor." Luca paid the compliment, thinking that the French crown prince was somewhat resistant to the topic of finding less mistresses, so he hurriedly made up for it. "Oh, by the way, His Majesty and I have already discussed it, and at least we will prepare for Clementine a dowry of 1,000,000 florins. She is our most cherished daughter, and we hope she can live happily in Paris." 1 florin is equivalent to approximately 2.5 livres, which is definitely a very generous dowry point, and when Joseph heard that she even talked about the dowry, his head was filled with black threads, and he sighed in his heart. "I have a second aunt. Clementine is my cousin. Your maiden name is also Bourbon. Note 1. So you are a close relative. If I really marry your daughter, all my descendants will be born with dementia and deformities. Actually, I think Vienna is better than Paris. It's warm in winter and cool in summer, and full of artistic atmosphere." Joseph didn't know how to change the topic. He happened to catch a glimpse of a place where spring water gushes out of the window and exclaimed, "Oh, is that the clear spring that His Majesty Matthias likes?" Matthias was a HRE emperor in the 17th century. When he saw the sweet spring, he liked it very much, so he built a hunting palace here, which was the predecessor of Schönbrunn Palace. Vidaluca frowned secretly, sensing that the French crown prince seemed reluctant to talk about his marriage to Clementine. "That's not the fountain, my dear, it's in the royal gardens." She took a deep breath and continued to smile. "We are the noblest and closest family. If you are dissatisfied with Clementine, cough. Cough cough." Joseph said to himself that what I was dissatisfied with was that we were a family. "Do you really have to finalize your marriage today?" He pretended to bend down and cough violently and waved to women. "This is damn pneumonia. Cough. Please help me get some medicine." The latter was startled. Hasn't His Highness not had an attack of pneumonia for a long time? But he reacted very quickly, stepped forward to support Joseph, and with the hint from the latter's eyes, he pushed aside the crowd and walked towards the lounge. Vidaluca looked at Joseph's back with a look of confusion on his face. In the next few days, except for discussing trade agreements with Leopold II and Austrian officials, Joseph used pneumonia as an excuse to cancel all banquets and entertainment, and did everything possible to avoid Clementine. Ni's mother Vidaluca. After the framework of the Franco-Austrian-German trade agreement was roughly agreed upon, he immediately bid farewell to Joseph II and returned to Paris as if he was fleeing. Vidaluca accompanied Joseph to a few miles southwest of Vienna with the honor guard, but failed to chat with him for a few more words. The French crown prince seemed to have serious pneumonia, and he coughed violently whenever he spoke. She couldn't help but frown as she recalled what people had inquired about Joseph's relationship in the past few days. The French crown prince only has one female doctor who is more than 3 years older than him, comes from a humble background, and likes to wear men's clothes. Apart from that, there are almost no other women. Why did he avoid marrying Clementine? You know, Leopold II is determined to be crowned emperor of the Shinra, and his daughter's status is definitely worthy of him. She turned to look at her husband and whispered, "My dear, has His Royal Highness the Crown Prince told you about the engagement?" Leopold II recalled it, shook his head and said, "Trade agreements are very important. We usually discuss issues in this area Occasionally we talk about hunting or shipbuilding, but we rarely talk about the love between children. Vidaluca frowned again, suddenly pulled Leopold second, and said with a serious expression, "You must have a serious discussion with your sister about Clementine's marriage. It is best to have it in the form of a letter of credence. Set their wedding date, May 2, 1789. More than 17,000 Austrian soldiers and 3,000 Bavarian soldiers left Luxembourg, an enclave in western Austria, and marched along the border with France to Liege, a border city in the southern Netherlands dozens of kilometers away. Point in the carriage in front of the team. A general with grey hair on his temples, but a calm and capable look in his eyes looked out the window and asked the officer beside the carriage casually, "Lieutenant Colonel Hayden, how far is it from Liege?" The latter quickly took out the map to check, then turned around and said, "General, there are still less than 3 miles. If we march normally, we will arrive tomorrow afternoon." "What?" he said was Ori, which is about 20 kilometers. The old man in the carriage is General Wilmser, the commander-in-chief of the Austrian army. He nodded and asked again, "Is there any news from the Musil Legion?" "Not yet, General. But according to the news they sent back yesterday, they should have entered Lon by now." Ron is a city north of Liège, bordering Brabant to the west, and is the connecting point between the two rebellious cities. Musil led a lightly armed corps with only a small amount of logistical supplies. According to General Wilmser's plan, they marched all the way around Liège and penetrated into this strategic location to block the front of the Brabant rebels. Come support Liège. Point at the same time, this place can also serve as an early warning to the Prussian army. If the Prussian army wants to go south, Longen is the only way. Point everything went according to plan. Wilmser was about to close the curtains when he suddenly remembered something and ordered the officer, "Oh, by the way, send someone to contact the French and ask them to transport the baggage supplies in 3 days to the south of Liège. We should have occupied it by then." "Yes, General." Lieutenant Colonel Hayden raised his hat in salute, then turned his horse to convey the order to the messenger. General Wilmser closed the curtains and smiled at General Ernst, the commander of the Bavarian army sitting opposite. The Margrave of Wallstadt's army was still in Cologne yesterday, and he must not have expected that we could arrive in Liège so quickly. The Margrave of Wallstadt was the Prussian General Blücher who led the army to intervene in the Dutch Patriot Party uprising. He is currently in the Duke of Brunswick's forward corps. Ernst nodded in agreement. Even if the Prussian army marches immediately, they will encounter Colonel Musil's obstruction in Long. We have at least a week to deal with the rebels in Liège, due to the logistical support from France. Of course, France only claimed that this was ordinary food and iron trade. The Austrian army brought almost no logistical baggage, so it marched very fast, even faster than the Prussians who were closer. Arrive in southern Netherlands early. Point General Wilmser leaned back in his chair, looking quite relaxed. "You overestimate those rebels. According to the intelligence sent a few days ago, they have less than 4,000 people, and most of them have not fought. It shouldn't take that long to defeat the peasants who have fought. My plan is to surround Brabant before the Prussians arrive. If the Duke of Brunswick insists on intervening in this war, you will be responsible for the encirclement task. I will lead the main force to turn back and fight with the Prussians. People fight, to put it bluntly. His combat deployment is very reasonable. Point. In order to reinforce the rebels in Brabant, the Prussians must have been in a hurry and neglected to take precautions. In the process, the Austrian army is likely to find an opportunity to ambush. Even if you are unlucky and fail to ambush successfully, you can at least choose a terrain that is favorable to you as the battlefield for the decisive battle. Point. General Wilmser then talked about the gossip he had heard. "Do you know anything about His Majesty Otto's plan to exchange Lower Bavaria for the southern Netherlands?" "General," Ernst said, "it seems that the French participated in this matter as a notary to ensure that both parties would not breach the contract. Therefore, it is very likely that the territorial exchange will be completed this time. Then, after the rebels surrender, you don't have to return to Munich." General Wilmser said with a smile, "His Majesty the King will be greeted directly in Brussels. After that, you can be promoted to at least 2 levels in Their view, the rabble in the southern Netherlands, are just walking military exploits, and the fighting will be over by the end of the month at most point. While they were thinking about the future, the 5,000 soldiers of the Austrian Musil army were in a dire situation in Lon Point. A group of cavalry who went out for reconnaissance found someone making a spiked roadblock next to a village. They were about to step forward to question them when they saw a priest holding a pitchfork and leading dozens of farmers blocking the road. The cavalry captain smiled contemptuously and ordered his men to line up and prepare to rush away these untouchables seeking death. According to his experience, when the war horse is still more than 10 meters away from those people, they will be frightened and hide everywhere. The 11 cavalrymen lightly lifted their reins, urged their horses forward, and then drew their sabers at the same time. Just as they were preparing to attack, there was a burst of gunfire from behind. A horse was hit in the thigh and fell to the ground with the cavalry. The priest immediately roared and rushed forward with his eyes wide open. The farmers, each armed with sticks and farm tools, followed the Austrian cavalry. The Austrians were immediately panicked. They did not expect that these untouchables would dare to launch an active attack. In just a moment's hesitation, the priest holding the pitchfork had already rushed 70 or 80 meters away from them. The cavalry captain hurriedly waved his sword forward and shouted, "Forward, jog, run, get ready for battle." The 10 cavalrymen rushed towards the farmers in shabby clothes like arrogant beasts. They saw that the priest at the front was less than 10 meters away. Just when they thought that the priest would avoid the horses, the latter raised his fork and pointed at them. They stabbed. The cavalryman opposite the priest moved skillfully. He flicked the reins to the left and past the side of the pitchfork. Then the saber lightly scratched the priest's chest. The blade came out and raised a large amount of blood. The farmers behind did not flinch under the encouragement of the priest and used crude weapons to greet the Austrian cavalry. However, the gap between them and professional soldiers was too great. At the cost of 7 or 8 lives, it only slowed down the cavalry. Without the leadership of the priest, the remaining farmers were finally demoralized by the blood and corpses. They began to drop their farm tools and fled towards the bushes on both sides, screaming. The Austrian cavalry was about to breathe a sigh of relief when gunshots rang out from behind again, and this time the distance was much closer than last time. The cavalry captain turned around and looked, his expression suddenly serious. There were 16 or 17 people holding flintlock rifles, forming a horizontal line, blocking their retreat. He gritted his teeth and ordered his men to turn around, preparing to rush back to report the news to the large army. However, the farmers who had just escaped turned back, holding farm tools and staring at them eagerly. Half an hour later, most of the Austrian cavalry were killed by flintlocks and clubs. Only one person escaped from the village with serious injuries. At the same time, Musil's army had just selected a camp and was nailing tents. Suddenly, hundreds of South Netherlanders rushed out of the dry river not far away and fired a barrage of loot at the Austrians. He set a few fires randomly in the camp area and then took advantage of the sky to get dark and got into the river. By the time the Austrians caught up, the opponent had already used the familiar terrain to escape and disappeared. Although this attack only killed a dozen Austrian soldiers, they had to be on high alert all night and could not get a good rest at all. Similar situations occurred everywhere in Lon, and the Protestant priests took up the important task of organizing the people to attack the Austrian army. They only received 2,000 flintlock muskets from the Netherlands half a month ago, but they dared to attack everywhere, which made the Austrians extremely annoyed. In order to deal with these harassments that appeared at any time, the Musil army's march became as slow as a snail. It was not until 3 days later that it finally arrived near the city of Long Point. Except for one who lost his way, all the cavalry sent by Colonel Musil to deliver a message to General Wilmser were intercepted and killed by the rebels. Until Wilmser led the main force and exchanged fire with the Liege rebels, the situation of Long was still unclear in Liege. The situation of the Austrians was not as optimistic as expected. On a high ground, General Wilmser saw in his telescope that the southern Netherlands rebels were instantly defeated under the impact of his skirmishers, and he couldn't help but smile. These rabble-rousers had no combat experience at all. They placed their line array on a sloping low hill, Trying to defend from a high position point, however, the Austrian army launched a strong attack from the left side of the slope, that is, the side with higher horizontal terrain point. The southern Netherlands, who were already at a disadvantage in terms of equipment and strength, were defeated without any surprise. General Wilmser had just ordered the cavalry to pursue and defeat the enemy. But he saw the South Dutchman roaring into the woods not far from the low mountain point. He suddenly frowned and felt as sick as a fly. A similar scene had occurred the day before yesterday. The rebels were obviously very familiar with the terrain. By the time his cavalry chased them, they had already scattered and fled, and in the end only captured less than 200 rebels arrived. Although he won this battle, nearly a day had passed from deploying his troops, to testing the attack, to breaking through the enemy's position. Let's take a rest after the battle. At least we can continue marching at noon tomorrow. He had been delayed by these despicable South Dutchmen for 3 full days, and he was still nearly 10 kilometers away from the town of Liège. Yesterday, the French sent people to ask why no one accepted the supplies shipped to the south of Liège, and most of them were robbed by the rebels. Note 1. Maria Vidaruca is the daughter of Carlos III and the biological sister of the current Spanish King Carlos IV. The Spanish royal family and the French royal family are both members of the Bourbon family and are very closely related by blood. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 298, The Decisive Battle in Rochefort. Send a good news to Vienna. The Liège rebellion has been put down. General Wilmser raised his hand tiredly to the staff officer aside. His Majesty the Emperor must be impatient to wait. He then looked at the Austrian soldiers who were lining up to enter the city of Liège. The 2 regiments responsible for the main attack today will stay and rest. The others will set off immediately and must arrive in Velem before tomorrow afternoon. Velem is the only way to South Brabant, more than 40 kilometers away. Note 1. 6 days after entering Liège province, the Austrian army, which was constantly harassed by the rebels, finally captured the city of Liège and achieved its first major victory since the war began. However, General Wilmser was not happy at all. This progress was much slower than he expected. Now the Prussian army has probably arrived near Brussels. In other words, his plan to surround the Brabant rebels and try to ambush the Prussians could no longer be implemented. And in today's battle against the Liège rebels, he still failed to eliminate the main force of the rebels. About 3,000 rebels decisively abandoned the city and fled toward Velem. He killed and captured less than 800 rebels in Liège. In addition, the situation on Long's side was also very bad. 3 days after the news of the loss of the Musil army, he sensed that something was wrong and sent a cavalry company north to check the situation. The cavalry finally returned yesterday, reporting that Musil had not yet been able to capture Long. General Wilmser steeled himself. As long as he could defeat the Prussians at Brabant, all this would be nothing. He took the reins from the attendant and was about to get on his horse when he suddenly saw a scout cavalry galloping towards him. He frowned immediately. Because the cavalry came from the south and the enemies should be in the north now. The scout saw the commander-in-chief 20 meters away and immediately shouted, "Emergency military situation. Rochefort has discovered the rebels. There are at least 5,000 people, General." Wilmser's pupils shrank. Why did those rebels run south? Rochefort was only 2 days away from Luxembourg, which was a must stop, whether transporting supplies from Austria or France. If Luxembourg is attacked by rebels, its own logistical supplies will immediately have problems. He looked anxiously in the direction of Brabant, hesitated again and finally sighed forcefully and said to the herald, "The whole army must gather and march towards Rochefort. Oh, let Colonel Musil give up Long, go to Velem immediately, to prevent the rebels from escaping back to Brabant." "Yes, General." Just as the Austrian army was complaining about the whole team heading south, outside the city of Namur not far northwest of Rochefort, the Duke of Brunswick, the commander-in-chief of the Prussian army, was galloping past the endless column of Prussian troops, waving his hands and shouting, "Get your damn legs out of the way. As long as you arrive at Rochefort before tomorrow, the glorious victory will be yours." As an old man over 70 years old. He is definitely getting stronger with age. He had been galloping like this for nearly 20 minutes continuously and kept shouting to boost morale. Finally, both he and the horse, exhausted of their strength, stopped panting. Marquis Blucher caught up from behind on horseback and handed the kettle to the Duke of Brunswick. "Marshal, please drink some water. Rochefort sent news just now, and the Dutch are ready. There are more than 12,000 people in total." The latter raised his head and drank a few sips of water, with a smile flashing at the corner of his mouth. "Where did that lawyer named Vandernot get so many people?" "The Dutch sent 200,000 gold shields and a lot of weapons. The Dutch quickly armed a large number of citizens. 200,000 Dutch guilders are equivalent to 2.5 million livres, which shows a strong support the Dutch have for their fellow Netherlands residents," Blucher said with some hesitation. "Marshal, is it really not dangerous for us to abandon Brabant? The Austrians are only 3 days away from there." The Duke of Brunswick shook the horse's reins and said calmly, "That old guy Wilmser never dares to take risks. Even if Brabant doesn't have a single soldier, he will not give up Luxembourg and attack there." 2 days later, the Austrian army arrived at the outskirts of Rochefort. Then General Wilmser received a report from the scouts and found at least 20,000 Prussian troops and tens of thousands of Dutch rebels in the southeast. General Wilmser immediately felt nervous. The Prussians were marching faster than he expected. He originally thought he would only face the rebels, but he didn't want to fight here. Fortunately, his many years of experience in commanding large armies enabled him to not neglect reconnaissance, thereby avoiding the dilemma of being ambushed. He immediately took out the map to check, pointed to a flat open area in front of him, and said to his staff in a deep voice, "Deploy troops here immediately. Let Winkler lead his skirmishers to set up outposts first, and watch out for Prussian raids." "Yes, General." However, when the Austrians began to line up at the position designated by Wilmser, 15 cannons suddenly appeared at the front of the Prussian army and began to launch a fierce bombardment at the Austrian army. Winkler's corps was the elite of the Austrian army. It withstood the bombardment and stood firm at the front of the open field. Behind them, the line infantry, encouraged, also began to form rapidly out of range of the enemy's artillery. The Prussian artillery fired a full 30 rounds, but because the skirmishers led by Winkler were dispersed, they only killed more than 200 people. However, the Prussian forward was unable to kill them under the threat of the Austrian skirmishers. Directly attack the main force of the Austrian army. General Wilmser finally waited until his main force was fully deployed and immediately ordered the artillery to start fighting back. The Winkler corps was his trump card, and every death made him feel heartbroken. The two sides exchanged fire for a while, and Wilmser finally noticed in the telescope that the front of the Prussian position seemed to be a line array composed of Dutch rebels. He was immediately overjoyed that the Duke of Brunswick had made such a stupid mistake, using such an amateur army with little training to take charge of the most important frontal battlefield. Once they are broken through, it will cause the entire Prussian army to collapse. Wilmser decisively said to the herald, "Order Schroeder to immediately attack the enemy's line formation. Let Berg's grenadiers also press forward, and the cavalry pay attention to protecting the two wings." "Yes, General." Note: 1. In the 18th century, the southern Netherlands, later known as the Brabant region of Belgium, was divided into two major parts, North and South. North Brabant, which includes Brussels, is slightly larger and belongs to the Dutch-speaking area. South Brabant is a smaller, French-speaking area. North and South Brabant combined form the most prosperous core area of the southern Netherlands. Chapter 299: Persistence and Defeat. More than 10,000 Dutch rebels formed two long and narrow infantry lines on a gentle slope, with 3 rows in front and back of each line. The soldiers were closely arranged and looked impressive from a distance. However, the messy costumes on their bodies and the different models of flintlock guns in their hands all proved that they were just a motley army gathered temporarily. In fact, it took them a full 6 hours to arrange their infantry lines starting from early this morning. The Dutch commanders were so tired that their legs cramped. When these miscellaneous troops saw the dense Austrian front line in the distance beginning to move, and a large number of ant-like skirmishers moving nimbly towards them, their hands almost began to tremble uncontrollably. Behind them, more than 1,000 Prussian soldiers kept shouting, "Keep calm and do nothing." The Priest in the Dutch queue also whispered to the soldiers beside him, "Don't think about anything later, just load the ammunition as quickly as possible. Then pay attention to the sound of the drum." When the fastest Austrian skirmishers appeared 80 steps ahead of the Dutch line formation, they began to hide behind weeds or rocks and shoot at the South Dutchman point. Several bullets flew through the air and landed on the line array. Immediately, some soldiers fell to the ground wailing, twisting, and twitching in pain. The Prussian soldiers behind them immediately shouted, "Don't move. Move the dead away. Keep the formation tight. Quick." However, the lack of training in the Netherlands did not seem to hear them. They just followed the injured and shouted randomly, or subconsciously raised their guns, to aim at the Austrians in the distance. As the Austrian main force continued to approach, the skirmishers began to disperse to both sides, giving way to the frontal battlefield. The Prussian officer estimated that the distance between the infantry lines of the two armies was less than 100 steps, and ordered the Dutch to start loading. The orderly soldier rode on horseback to convey the reloading instructions, and the drummer beat the specific drum beat for reloading. Soldiers operating weapons according to this rhythm can maintain the highest reloading efficiency. The Austrians continued to advance, and when they were 60 steps away from the enemy, they still had no intention of stopping shooting. The Dutch line formation finally could no longer hold its strength. The huge sense of oppression from nearly 10,000 people rushing in front of them made the soldiers' minds go blank, and they just wanted to use every method to drive these people away. Sporadic gunshots appeared throughout the online array. The Prussian officer in charge was worried that this motley group of troops would waste all their ammunition, so he had to order the entire army to shoot. After a chaotic volley that lasted for half a minute, the Dutch position was shrouded in black smoke, but the results were very limited. The Austrians continued to advance in an orderly formation. It was not until the two sides were 50 steps apart that the Austrian army stopped. With a burst of intensive drum beats, the soldiers raised their flintlock guns, shooting under the orders of the Austrian commander. Large fires erupted from the endless infantry lines, and the fierce salvo fire knocked hundreds of small gaps in the Dutch front. Past a Netherland yelled, "Don't be afraid. Keep loading. For the sake of your families and to drive away the Habsburg tyrant, everyone, hold on." It seemed that their encouragement had an effect. Although their hands and feet were trembling, the motley crew barely completed the filling, then gritted their teeth and raised their guns, waiting for the Prussian officer's instructions on the distant hill. General Wilmser frowned and looked at the battlefield in the telescope. The brave grenadiers under his command fired more than 10 rounds of volleys at the Dutchmen, killing at least 1,000 people, but the enemy still showed no sign of collapse. Behind the Dutch infantry line, there was another line of defense composed of infantry. There should be Prussians further behind. "These damn rebels. Why are you still standing there?" He cursed secretly, and was thinking about whether to invest more skirmishers to tear the enemy's flanks apart, when he suddenly heard the rapid hooves of the scouts approaching quickly. As soon as he turned his head, he heard the visitor shout breathlessly, General, the Prussians are outflanking our right wing." Before Wilmser could react, his staff came over with binoculars and exclaimed, "General, there is a commotion on the left wing of the cavalry. There may be enemy troops there." Wilmser suddenly turned pale. It seemed that the Prussians were not behind the Dutch infantry line. This guy from Brunswick actually used his main force to sneak attack on his two wings. He waved his cane vigorously and shouted to the herald, "Order Schuradel to break through the enemy's front as quickly as possible at all costs. As long as we are the first to defeat their infantry line, victory will belong to us." 4. The decisive battles of large corps in this era, the frontal defense line is like a person's waist and abdomen. Once it is breached, first of all, the commander will have nowhere to stay. Suffering from poor communication capabilities, if a commander must move at high speed to escape an enemy attack, the herald will immediately lose sight of him, causing the entire army to lose command. In addition, the loss of the frontal battlefield means that artillery and cavalry have no safe space for preparation. For these two arms that require a lot of preparation work, this is equivalent to losing combat effectiveness. Therefore, as long as the head-on confrontation can be won, the losses on both wings are nothing at all. The Grenadier Regiment on the right side of the Austrian infantry line moved forward more bravely and fought back against the bullets of the Dutch. Finally, after taking a lot of casualties, they tore a gap on the left side of the Dutch line. The Austrian skirmishers, like sharks that smell blood, immediately swarmed towards the gap and kept shooting at non-commissioned officers and drummers to increase the confusion of the enemy troops. Seeing the collapse of the first line of infantry in the Netherlands, Wilmser clenched his fists excitedly and then nervously looked to the right, where the sound of the Prussian cavalry's hooves could be faintly heard. The combat effectiveness of the Austrian cavalry was not as good as that of the Prussians, and they were sent to the left wing just now, so they could not resist the Prussians for long. He turned the telescope again, anxiously urging Schroeder to tear through the Dutch second line of defense as soon as possible. On the other side, the Duke of Brunswick put away his telescope and said to the herald with a relaxed expression, "Go and tell the Dutch that, as long as they persist for 15 minutes, the Austrians will get out of this land." He could estimate the speed of his main force, which should have been in contact with the Austrian right wing by now. Yes, his cavalry was just a cover. He devoted all 14,000 Prussian main forces to outflank the Austrian right wing. That was his trump card. After this period of contact with the people of the southern Netherlands, he was deeply impressed by their tenacity. Although these miscellaneous troops had low combat effectiveness and were not even in order, their morale was extremely high. Perhaps it was their pursuit of so-called freedom that made them willing to die to drive away the Austrian emperor. Especially the priests, as if they were waiting to ascend to heaven. They were not afraid of any enemy. Therefore, he judged that, although these Dutchmen could not defeat the Austrian army at all, it was very possible for them to hold Wilmser back. On the distant battlefield, the second line of Dutch infantry, which had been riddled with holes, seemed to be crumbling, but it still persisted and did not collapse. Many of the Prussians supervising the battle behind them were shot to death by stray bullets, and chaos began to arise, but they still stood there, clumsily reloading their ammunition repeatedly with trembling hands, and fired at the Austrians indiscriminately until their lives were taken away by bullets, but never moved. The Austrian right wing had been crushed to pieces by the overwhelmingly superior Prussian army. Chapter 300. Dad is here. Something big must be happening. Second floor of the Palace of Versailles. Sunlight reflected from the huge arched floor-to-ceiling windows into the spacious corridor, making the crown prince and his entourage seem to be enveloped in a pale golden light curtain. So, Austria was defeated. Joseph frowned slightly and looked at Eamon, who was holding the report that had just been sent. "Indeed, Your Highness." The latter glanced at the document in his hand. General Wilmser lost more than 5,000 soldiers and was almost surrounded by the Prussian army. He retreated to Luxembourg and barely blocked the Prussian attack. Chase. Joseph shook his head secretly. He remembered that historically Wilmser would not be defeated until the end of this year, and it was not yet June. He looked at Eamon again. "You just mentioned that the Dutch also provided support to the southern Netherlands." "Yes, Your Highness. The military expenses of the Prussian-Nigerian coalition forces and the weapons of the rebels are basically provided by the Dutch Provincial Federation Council." "It's no wonder." Joseph sighed. It turned out that the Dutch were much more involved than in history. This may be the reason why the Austrian army retreated quickly. "It seems that my butterfly wings have had a considerable impact on the progress of history." If William V was still ruling the Netherlands, the lying faction, the Netherlands would not support the Brabant rebels so generously. Of course, it is also possible that the British did more operations behind the scenes, which triggered this series of results. Eamon continued. "Your Highness, according to the report sent back by the intelligence Bureau the day before yesterday, the Dutch are likely to claim sovereignty over the southern Netherlands, and Van der Noort seems to be very willing to accept the Dutch." Van der Noort was one of the leaders of the Brabant uprising. Joseph asked again. "What about the conservatives in the southern Netherlands? That guy named Wing or something like that?" "You mean Henry Unk, Your Highness?" "Yes, that's him. He doesn't seem to be taking a position on it." Joseph nodded and ordered, "Please send someone to ask Director Fausch to come." We need to contact Wenk as soon as possible. He rubbed his brows. In this case, matters in southern Netherlands will have to be dealt with first. Oh, please read me my recent itinerary. Okay, Your Highness. Your current itinerary is, depart for Saint Etienne at noon today, to inspect the Royal Ordnance Factory there. Then, we will go south to Lyon to promote automatic looms. Before that, Mr. Bale will report to you about the newly established insurance company. The next stop is Troyes, where I personally presided over the military combat effectiveness assessment and gave a speech to the 1st Guards Corps. The next step is to inspect the logistics and material preparations at Verdun. If things go well in Bavaria, you will go to Munich to sign a trade agreement with Austria and other countries on behalf of His Majesty the King. If the negotiations on the trade agreement are delayed, you will go to Saxony first. Joseph waved his hand tiredly. Please advance the task of presiding over the Army's combat effectiveness assessment and inspecting the Verdun logistics site. The rest can only be put aside for now. Joseph knew that after Austria suffered a defeat in the southern Netherlands, it would definitely not give up. Historically, Austria even hesitated to interrupt reforms and mobilized nearly 200,000 troops with all its national strength to prepare for a war of national annihilation with Prussia. It took 2.5 years to finally put out the Brabant uprising point, and he wanted to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to expand this war as much as possible, thereby driving a wedge between Prussia and Austria and eliminating the possibility of them joining forces to deal with France. If the previous layout in Poland can also achieve certain results so that Russia, Prussia, and Austria cannot carve up Poland, or it can be postponed for a few years, the common interests of Prussia and Austria can be eliminated. As a result, the main theme of the future war on the European continent will most likely be between Austria and Prussia, competing for the position of the German leader. France will no longer have to face the troublesome anti-French alliance, and will become strategically more at ease. As continental powers, Prussia and Austria will definitely compete to win over France. There is so much room for France to profit from this at present. Wilmser is rapidly defeated in the southern Netherlands, so Joseph can only put domestic matters aside and give priority to rectifying armaments. After all, if you want to gain profits in the Austro-Prussian war, you must first have a powerful army that can have an impact on the war situation. The stronger you are, the more valuable you are to win over. Therefore, every livre invested in armaments today may receive 10 or even hundreds of livres in return in the future. Your Highness, we have to speed up a little. Your Majesty may have to wait in a hurry. A palace official walking in front saw the Crown Prince stopped and was talking to his attendants and hurriedly turned around to remind him. Oh, okay. Joseph hurriedly took 2 steps to catch up with the palace official and then asked casually, by the way, what does Her Majesty the Queen want from me? The latter prevaricated skillfully, Your Highness, I don't know about this, but Her Majesty the Queen's expression is very serious and she seems to have important matters. Oh, His Majesty the King is also there. Ah, Father is here too? Joseph suddenly realized that something big had happened. Otherwise it would be unlikely to alarm Louis XVI, the king of hang-ups for thousands of years. When he arrived at the Little Trianon, he saw his father and mother sitting by the window listening to music, obviously waiting for him intently. He hurriedly stepped forward and bowed. When Queen Mary saw her precious son coming, the serious expression on her face suddenly relaxed, and she waved to him. My dear, sit here quickly. Joseph sat next to his mother and listened to her. Your uncle sent a special envoy just now. Joseph blinked. Uncle? Which uncle? It's the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Louis XVI reminded from the side. Queen Mary pushed the dessert plate with pudding and macarons in front of her son. The special envoy told me and your father about the physical condition of His Majesty the Emperor. As you said a few days ago, I'm afraid it's not optimistic. The emperor she was talking about naturally meant Joseph II. The special envoy also specifically mentioned your cousin. The Queen stared into Joseph's eyes. My dear, you are not young anymore. It's time to decide on a marriage partner. When I was your age, I already had married to your father. What do you think of Clementine? Your father and I both like her. Maybe we can propose marriage to your uncle. Joseph almost choked on his own spit, stood up suddenly, and waved his hands in embarrassment. This, I'm afraid. Actually, regarding the causes of genetic diseases, these close relatives, is it better for us to discuss it again? How could Queen Mary not see what her son meant? She couldn't help but frown slightly. Joseph, do you have any dissatisfaction with Clementine? Or do you already have someone else in mind? End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.